Good morning, everyone. As the Secretary of the Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee, it is my pleasure to call this meeting to order. We are thrilled to welcome you to the first EEMAC meeting with Commissioner Mercinger as the sponsor of the committee. We're also excited to be here in person at Oklahoma State University. This is the first EEMAC meeting ever held outside of the walls of the CFTC. I would like to thank Dean Wiggins for continuing to serve as the EEMAC chair and welcome all of our new and returning members and associate members. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid fashion. Several participants are here in person, but several are also on the phone. So, to ensure that the meeting goes as smoothly as possible and a recording of the meeting is complete and accurate, please note the following. If you are in person and you would like to be recognized during today's discussion, please place your name card so it sits vertically on the table. Before you speak, please identify yourself and the organization that you represent on the EEMAC. Also, the microphones are on, so please be cognizant of side conversations. If you are participating virtually and would like to be recognized during the discussion for a question or comment or need technical assistance, please message me within the Zoom chat. I will alert EEMAC Chair Dean Wiggins that you would like to speak during the Q&A that follows the prepared remarks and presentations. Please identify yourself before you begin speaking and signal when you are done speaking. Please speak directly into your phone for optimal audio quality on the webcast. Please unmute your Zoom video before you speak and mute both after you speak. Please only turn on your camera when you are engaged in the Q&A after the panels. If you are disconnected from Zoom at any time, please close your browser and enter Zoom again using the link that I previously provided for today's meeting. Before we begin this morning's discussion, I would like to turn it over to Commissioner Mercinger for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for joining me, whether virtually or here in Stillwater this morning. And welcome to the first EEMAC meeting that's held outside of a CFTC building. You might notice that this is a slight distinction from what our press release said, because after we sent the press release, we learned that the late Commissioner Bart Chilton actually held an EEMAC meeting in the New York City office. And he had options set up for participation in DC and Chicago through teleconference. So Commissioner Chilton actually held the first meeting outside of DC. And I think he's technically the first person to hold a hybrid EEMAC meeting. So what I think that means is this is kind of a forward-looking committee. Thanks to my fellow commissioners and the chairman for joining us today, and certainly all of our guests that are here and online. Our panel participants, thank you for joining us. Dina, thank you so much for agreeing to chair the committee again and being here in person. And thanks to my chief of staff, Chris Lucas, who did a lot to put this together. And certainly a special thanks to Lauren Foltz, who is the secretary of EEMAC. She has gone above and beyond today. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have Lauren as our secretary. And all I know is she's out of Kansas City, but she is an amazing asset to the entire agency. So thank you, Lauren. I also want to recognize Emma Alexander, who is here from Congressman Frank Lucas's office. Her boss, Congressman Lucas, is a former chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, and he's always been a strong champion of the CFTC. So thank you, Emma, for joining us today. When I was first considering which CFTC advisory committee that I wanted to sponsor, I was particularly drawn to EEMAC because it's direct connection to the broader economy. So when we flick on the lights, when we boil water, or when we enter a Zoom or a Teams meeting, we're using energy. We might not think about where that energy comes from, and that's a privilege that's not known around the globe. We are very fortunate here in the United States to have the most accessible and reliable and affordable energy system. But we shouldn't take for granted this privilege because it takes a great deal of investment, planning, and infrastructure. It also takes liquid and well-functioning derivatives markets. Now more than ever, as we look at global markets and face geopolitical risks around the world, it's important to gather facts and prepare for the future of these essential markets. Critical energy infrastructure investments in the US contribute to the strength and vibrancy of energy futures markets regulated by the CFTC. But we cannot forget that physical infrastructure requires repairs, updates, and upgrades to remain efficient. Ignoring existing infrastructure and failing to invest in updates and upgrades to traditional energy infrastructure will not only make the transition to renewable sources of energy costlier and more difficult, it could prevent us from ever achieving our well-intended clean energy goals. So in that context, as we look broadly at energy and environmental derivatives markets, I see two areas where the EEMAC can offer valuable insight and expertise. First is evaluating what is required to ensure the energy markets in the US remain resilient, despite the numerous strains on the system globally. Predictable supply and reliable distribution of physical energy is critical to ensuring the derivatives markets we regulate at the CFTC continue to serve as efficient price discovery tools, helping end users and other market participants hedge and manage risk. And second is evaluating what emerging threats could potentially impact our CFTC regulated futures markets as we focus on energy transition in the face of ever-changing geopolitical factors. Does that transition risk pose a threat to our overall financial stability, given the importance of an affordable and reliable energy supply to our entire economy? So today we're going to look at two areas related to those questions. First, investment in physical energy infrastructure and the effect on the broader economy, including commodity derivatives markets, and the role of critical metals as components in traditional energy sources and potential impact and opportunities for the components of transitional energy sources and the potential impact and opportunities for CFTC regulated metals markets. The utility of energy commodity futures markets is closely tied to the underlying commodities creation, transmission, and eventual use. Distortion in any of those three phases can have a significant impact on CFTC regulated markets. These markets tend to function as the economic shock absorbers in times of market volatility. Sometimes we've seen this firsthand over the last few years. Without properly functioning energy futures markets, the financial risks from current global energy-related supply disruptions, as well as the cost of transitioning from traditional energy sources to more renewable forms of energy, have the potential to become systemic risk to our entire economy. I don't want to sound too apocalyptic here, so I recognize that there are very smart and dedicated individuals who are working to really understand these risks and identify policies and actions to avoid these dangers. And we're fortunate to have a few of those individuals around this table today and with us virtually as well as those who are going to be presenting today. So on our first panel, we have Courtney Colley who's a senior economist in the Regional Affairs Department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and Paul White, senior legal advisor to Commissioner James Stanley of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. James is going to discuss generation and transmission of traditional energy. Courtney is joining us today actually from here in Oklahoma. She's an LSU grad. Paul made the trip all the way from DC to Oklahoma, so we're very grateful to have both of them here. I know how valuable both of your time is, and we certainly are honored to hear from you today. On our second panel, we are fortunate enough to have Derek Salmon from Senior Managing Director, Commodity and Options Products at the CME. And Derek is going to discuss the current state of the metals markets and provide some thoughts on where he thinks these markets are headed. And Derek is an esteemed member of the EEMAC, and I'm extremely grateful that he's sharing what I'm learning is just a small sliver of all the knowledge that he has with us today. Derek's presentation is a start of what I believe will be a really novel discussion around what is needed to achieve stated policy goals around transitioning away from fossil fuel-based energy. Copper, aluminum, steel, and lithium are just a few examples of the metal inputs necessary for environmentally generated energy production and end use. Any discussion around energy transition is not complete without discussing these commodities and associated markets. Again, I just want to thank my fellow commissioners, the chairman, committee members, associate members, and all guests that are taking time out of their busy schedule to explore these topics with us today. Quick thank you to Oklahoma State University for allowing us to hold this meeting today on campus. It's truly an honor to be here. Yesterday, we had the privilege of talking to Dr. Riley's Commodity Futures Markets class and share some insights into the role of the CFTC. You may have met a few future commissioners in the group, although Dr. Riley wasn't sure, but definitely it was great to see young students interested in what we do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the chairman and my fellow commissioners who are joining us virtually today. We'll have a recorded message from Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero. I think today it's going to be exciting. It's going to be a robust and informative discussion. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Commissioner Mercier. I now recognize Chairman Benham to give his opening remarks.
Thanks, Lauren. Good morning to everyone at OSU. Want to really echo the Commissioner Mercier's comments. Really amazing that we're able to have this meeting in Stillwater, and want to thank everyone for pulling this together and hosting us on campus. Special thanks to Commissioner Mercier for getting the EEMAC together. I know this is her first meeting, but really timely issues and a timely topic to discuss. Certainly want to recognize Lauren and Dina Wiggins as well, and many members of the EEMAC. Good to see a lot of familiar names and faces who have been longtime contributors to the advisory committee. I will be brief. Commissioner Mercier pointed out all the right reasons why the issues that she decided to discuss today could not be more important to both derivatives markets and the CFTC, but our country, given what's going on from a geopolitical standpoint, from an economic standpoint, as we continue to recover from COVID and see logistics and supply chains return, albeit slowly, and some of these fluctuations and volatility that we're seeing in our commodity markets, the physical commodity markets on the metal side, on the energy side. Discussions like this could not be more timely. Getting feedback from producers, from end users, from everyone in that value chain is so critical. We're seeing a lot of unique things in our market that we typically don't see. And as Commissioner Mercier pointed out, we need our markets to be effective and to be serving the purpose, which is we know what they're there for: price discovery and risk management. And as we look to the future for both energy security, technology security, national security, these component parts on the energy side, and of course on the metal side, which I think is such a fascinating conversation in the short term, but especially the long term, is going to be critically important. So laying the groundwork with discussions like this with experts really gives us a sense of what we could be doing better, how we need to be thinking about these issues, and how we need to be thinking about these issues with our colleagues within the US government, across different agencies, whether it's FERC, Treasury Department, other market regulators, State Department, and whatnot. So really helpful, really looking forward to the conversation and where this leads us as an agency and collectively as a group to think about these important physical commodity markets and what role the CFTC can play. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks again to OSU, Commissioner. Great meeting, great discussion, and looking forward to the discussion for the afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Benham. I now recognize Commissioner Johnson to give her opening remarks.
I don't think we have audio on Commissioner Johnson unless it's just me.
We don't have audio for her.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to come back to Commissioner Johnson. We are now going to hear from Commissioner Goldsmith Romero, who has prepared pre-recorded remarks.
Hello, I'm pleased to join you for today's EMAC meeting. My thanks to Commissioner Mersinger and also to the committee members who met with me to discuss the challenges that they are facing. The CFTC plays a critical role in the whole of government approach to addressing the continuing challenges for U.S. and global energy infrastructure. There have been recent sobering reminders of how crucial it is to have reliable, resilient energy infrastructure. The Texas grid failed during a 2021 winter storm, costing hundreds of lives and leaving millions without power. And recently, we saw the California power grid was strained by a historic heat wave that led to cell phone alerts urging millions to reduce power or risk blackouts. Climate change is straining energy infrastructure that was built decades ago and was not designed to withstand frequent extreme weather events, or for that matter, new technology like cryptocurrencies. Our energy infrastructure also faces threats from cyber attacks, which we saw with the Colonial Pipeline attack. The cybersecurity of our energy infrastructure is a national security priority. Energy security has also taken center stage, particularly ensuring adequate energy supplies to keep families warm this winter. Skyrocketing prices will raise costs on families, forcing many to choose between life's essentials like food and medicine and keeping their families warm. Recent events make clear that the effect that vulnerabilities in energy infrastructure can have on prices, just as we saw with the Texas grid, Colonial Pipeline, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Price increases and volatility for oil and natural gas have real direct impact on American families and businesses who have to make hard choices about how to spend limited funds. As the U.S. continues its transition towards more renewable energy sources, we are facing challenges that require a whole of government approach. For its part, the CFTC plays a critical role to ensure that markets for key energy commodities are not distorted through fraud or manipulation, and that futures and derivatives markets are fair and orderly. In this transition to more renewable energy sources, we also must be mindful of the need for reliability. Renewable sources of energy like wind and solar require storage technology because the amount of power produced may not be consistent. So storage technology in turn depends on reliable access to key commodity components like lithium, copper, and nickel that serve as inputs to battery production. Recent dramatic increases in battery component prices highlight the need to ensure the integrity of derivatives markets. A cornerstone of the transition will be protecting our infrastructure and key markets to ensure that we have the capacity and resilience to support the transition and to provide reliable access to affordable clean energy to Americans. The CFTC must also ensure that excessive speculation does not distort and worsen challenges in agriculture, energy, and metals commodity markets. Unfortunately, the challenges for hardworking families extend beyond energy and metals markets. From 2020 lows, food prices have soared 84%, fertilizer prices have risen 220%, and energy prices have climbed to an all-time high. American families face difficult choices at the grocery store, the pump, and the thermostat. In sharp contrast, I am troubled by a recent study that Wall Street's biggest banks and commodity trading houses and hedge funds are making record profits on commodity trading this year. In August, I went on a listening tour visiting farmers and producers in Michigan and Arkansas who told me about high inputs, limiting fertilizer use, reduced crops, and high fuel costs. Universally, I heard that they expected the CFTC to fulfill its core mission, to protect the integrity of the futures markets, to ensure that prices reflect the legitimate forces of supply and demand, and to combat excess speculation and manipulation. In one of our market intelligence briefings several weeks ago, I recommended that the CFTC conduct deep dive studies into trading in key commodities that were experiencing significant volatility or price increases and publicly release our findings. And I reiterate my recommendation today publicly. I propose that the Commission conduct deep dive studies in key commodities markets, starting with those under stress, natural gas, crude oil, and wheat, to determine whether prices are being determined by market fundamentals. We should not overlook any factor that might contribute to increased food, energy, and metal costs, but instead examine all material elements driving volatility and pricing. This includes examining trading by passive investment vehicles and other speculators to ensure that they are appropriately providing liquidity and not inadvertently or deliberately distorting markets or otherwise undermining the price discovery process. This would lead to greater confidence that our markets are appropriately providing price discovery and risk management, if that is indeed the case, and prioritize the interests of the farmers, ranchers, and producers who provide food, fiber, and fuel for the world. It would show the world that the Commission is performing its responsibility to monitor the appropriateness and application of its rules. This important work would ensure that American families are not paying artificially increased prices due to excess speculation. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you to Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero for her remarks. I now recognize Commissioner Johnson to give her opening remarks.
Good morning. I'm hopeful that you can hear me. I will assume you can because we're getting a little feedback here. Thank you, Commissioner Mersinger, for the kind invitation to join you for this meeting of EEMAC, the inaugural meeting of this advisory committee under your leadership. It is my pleasure to appear with Chair Benham and my fellow commissioners. I also want to extend my gratitude to the members of this committee. These are volunteer roles, and I understand that you have very demanding day jobs. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. We value your input greatly. I am very sad to miss being there with you today, but excited that one of my fellow commissioners had the great insight to host a meeting in a place where I have many family members and friends. From my family's house in Dallas, you can hop on Interstate 35, and if you drive north on I-35 for a couple of hours, you'll arrive at the University of Oklahoma's beautiful campus. I guess you could say I know a little bit about Oklahoma. And if I were more specific, I'd say I mostly know a little bit about the Oklahoma Sooners. The Sooners have played more than 1,200 football games in over 121 seasons. I could probably become even more specific about my knowledge with respect to Sooner football using two words: Barry Switzer. Switzer moved to the University of Oklahoma as assistant coach under the newly anointed head coach and his good friend, Jim McKenzie. In 1973, Barry became head coach and won 3 national football championships as head coach at Oklahoma. In truth, this was many, many, many years before my time. But in 1994, Jerry Jones, owner of the Dallas Cowboys, hired Switzer to replace Jimmy Johnson, who had been head coach and won 2 previous Super Bowls. In 1995, the Cowboys went 12-4. Dallas won Super Bowl 30 over the Pittsburgh Steelers 27-17, making Switzer only one of 3 coaches to win a college national championship and a Super Bowl. While my grandfather and my dad taught me to enjoy college and pro football, I have never played on a football team. As a commissioner, however, I know that it is important to be part of a team. We are 5 individuals who may vigorously debate questions and issues. The how, meaning the path that we will adopt to achieve common goals. We are, however, undivided and united in our understanding of why, or the reason that we serve. Our preeminent commodity and derivatives markets are esteemed by many around the world. Our task is to maintain and improve the integrity of our financial markets. We can vigorously debate how, but we must never lose sight of why we work to achieve these goals. For many sectors of our economy, value is based on the production of real goods and services that travel throughout the stream of commerce to every corner of our nation and the four corners of the earth. To that end, investments are critical in maintaining and improving energy infrastructure. Investments in energy infrastructure are critical to our economy. President Biden recently signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Among other investments, the law allocates $65 billion to upgrade the electric transmission grid infrastructure to improve system reliability and resiliency, and to facilitate the expansion of renewables and clean energy. Funding will be distributed to harden the transmission grid and to reduce risks caused by wildfires, hurricanes, and other disruptive events, and to build out thousands of miles of new transmission lines. The bill represents the most significant government commitment to infrastructure since the building of the U.S. highway system after World War II. That includes the 1,500-mile stretch of highway rising from Laredo, Texas, and passing through my hometown, through where you are today, and reaching north to Duluth, Minnesota. Last month, I spent a week traveling through North, Central, and South Texas, visiting with energy producers, traders, and family ranchers who have been in the business for generations. This expenditure is part of our legacy, one that we leave for future generations. Investing in creating long-lived assets that are supposed to last for decades is difficult if one cannot predict the cost to build, maintain, and replace infrastructure resources. The complexity of planning capital expenditures associated with energy production cannot be overstated. Price volatility, particularly inflationary volatility, may engender challenges for commodity producers. When derivatives markets work well, they offer an essential mechanism to mitigate or transfer risk and manage pricing. This, I would point out, is an element of the reason why we serve. During today's meeting, you are also planning to discuss the role of the metals market as components of transitional energy sources, as well as a potential impact on financial markets regulated by the CFTC. Here, it is important to note that our markets are global. Geopolitical events in Europe, specifically the invasion of Ukraine, has led to remarkable disruptions in energy and agriculture markets. Many questions remain. Have we successfully identified transitional energy sources? Do we have access to the resources or the components that will make it possible to power our farms, schools, churches, universities, and businesses? For many of the issues that you will discuss, the solution may be elusive and even difficult to identify or define. If the solutions were easy to find, by now we might have identified and implemented them. Yet this is the right time to begin asking hard questions and facing difficult truths and preparing for the future that we want to build. Again, we may not agree immediately on the path or how, but we can agree today on the reasons why. Thank you for allowing me to join you today. I look forward to the thoughtful dialogue and discussion of today's meeting.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson. I now recognize Commissioner Pham to give her opening remarks.
Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be with you all, and I will keep my remarks brief. I'm excited to be attending my first EMAC meeting as a CFTC commissioner. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today in Oklahoma as I'd originally planned. In fact, one of my earliest assignments as an intern at the CFTC was to research Cushing, and I'd hoped to finally see it with my own eyes and see if I actually got it right. I would like to thank Commissioner Mersinger for her sponsorship of this committee and the EMAC members for their service. I am thrilled that the EMAC will have the benefit of Commissioner Mersinger's sponsorship and leadership. The EMAC hits closer to home because energy markets and commodity markets impact our everyday lives. Without efficient and effective markets, we feel the impact in just about every aspect of our daily lives, from the moment we turn on the lights to sitting down to dinner. Commissioner Mersinger's focus on ensuring that the CFTC pursues policies that promote reliable energy supplies and stable prices for all Americans is more important than ever. As my other commissioners have noted, the pain of energy costs this summer has been well documented. Everyone was impacted, whether with gas prices on road trips or electricity bills for air conditioning. And overseas, as I was just recently in Europe, policymakers are grappling with the fallout from the Russian pipeline shutdown, proposing to curb energy consumption in response. More drastic measures reportedly considered included price caps on wholesale power and gas, as well as suspending derivatives trading and imposing bans for futures trading. While The CFTC is a regulator with decades of experience in volatile energy markets under stress and has shown global leadership in developing appropriate policy responses. We, as CFTC commissioners, need to consider the vital role our markets play in the current conditions. Therefore, it is critical to have this advisory forum for expert input from the public, and I look forward to the EEMAC's consideration of these and other issues in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. Dina, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you now.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Commissioner Merthinger, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnson, Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero, and Commissioner Pham. I'm honored to be a member of the EEMAC and continue serving as chair of the EEMAC. And Commissioner Merthinger, we are certainly honored that you chose to sponsor EEMAC. We really look forward to working with you. We appreciate your leadership. There are a lot of important issues that we will be grappling with, as others have said, and we look forward to diving into those along with you. So thank you very much. The committee serves an important vehicle to discuss matters of concern to hedgers, consumers, exchanges, firms, and end users from our energy and environmental markets, as well as the Commission's regulations of these markets. There'll be 2 panels during today's meeting with prepared presentations. Following each panel, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A, as well as opportunities for discussion and questions on the creation of a subcommittee related to that panel. As chair, I look forward to facilitating the discussion of the associate members' perspective to the EEMAC and working with the EEMAC members to provide the Commission with feedback and recommendations that assist the agency in the oversight of our markets. To ensure that today's discussion is consistent with the EEMAC charter, which prohibits associate members from providing reports and recommendations directly to the Commission, we will first take questions and comments from EEMAC associate members after the panelists have shared their prepared remarks. We'll then turn to the EEMAC members for their questions and comments on the prepared remarks and any feedback provided by the associate members. As Lauren mentioned, for people in the room, if you desire to speak, if you turn your tent card on the side. For those who are participating virtually, if you can just let Lauren know in the chat function that you wish to speak, and we will try to manage this so that everyone gets a chance to participate. Before we begin our panel, we would like to do a roll call of the members and associate members so we have your attendance on the record. And Lauren, please roll call.
Thank you, Tina. EEMAC members, after I say your name and organization, please indicate you are present. Please make sure your phone is not muted. If we are unable to hear your response, please send me a message via the Zoom chat to confirm that you are present on today's, that I can correctly report it. True Land, Ice Futures Association, Ice Futures US. Unmute your microphone. Rob Kramer, FIA PTG.
Present.
Demetria Carusas, Nodal Exchange LLC.
Present. Good morning, everyone.
William McCoy, Morgan Stanley.
Present.
Loba Parikh, Edison Electric Institute.
Present.
Jackie Roberts, Public Service Commission of West Virginia. Derek Salmon, CME Group.
Present.
And Tyson Slocum, Public Citizen.
Present.
Thank you. EEMAC associate members, after I say your name, please indicate that you are present. Matt Agan, American Gas Association. Bob Anderson, Committee of Chief Risk Officers.
Present.
Susan Burgos, Exelon Corporation.
Present, and it is Constellation Energy Generation LLC.
Sorry about that. Just about it. Greg Broussard, Cargo Inc.
Present.
Paul Sisio, Industrial Energy Consumers America.
Present.
Dell DTCC Data Repository. Frank Hagan, Calpine Corporation.
Present.
Paul Hughes, Southern Company.
Present.
Jeff Hume, Continental Resources.
Present.
Frank Macchiarella, American Petroleum Institute.
Present.
John Belvey, Expansive.
Present.
John Mark Conrad, Beagle.
Present.
John Murphy, Mizuho Securities. Matt McCarty, Commercial Energy Working Group. Melinda Prudencio, the Energy Authority.
Present.
Dr. Richard Sander, Environmental Financial Products.
Present.
Mike Taylor, Aegis Hedging Solutions.
Present.
Sarah Malty, VP Energy.
Present.
Jeff Walker, ACES.
Present.
Aaron Works, National Teachers Association. Thank you. I will now turn the meeting back over to Tina.
Our first panel today will discuss the investment in physical energy infrastructure and the effect on price volatility in the commodities markets. We'll hear from two panelists, Courtney Cowley, Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and Paul Wright for Courtney.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and members of the committee, and also Commissioner Merthinger. It's really an honor to be here today, especially at my alma mater, where I had the opportunity to design and build a hydrogen fuel cell for renewable energy production as an undergrad, and then complete a PhD dissertation on renewable energy on farm renewable energy generation as a grad student. So I think all those things really mean that I'm very excited to be here, and not only is it an honor, but it's very interesting to hear from all of you, and also to get to tag along yesterday with the class of Aggie students, and then over the tour in Cushing. So today, I of course am an economist at the Federal Reserve, and as a part of the Federal Reserve's mission to maintain stable prices and full employment from a monetary policy perspective. All of our reserve banks specialize in specific industries that are important to their local economies. So I represent the Kansas City Fed. We're in the middle of the country where agriculture and energy are very important industries to our regional economy, but also, of course, to the national economy as well. So we have staff that focus specifically on these areas. I am a trained agricultural economist. That is the industry that I specifically focus on. And so today, how that relates to our panel on investment in infrastructure and impacts on commodity markets, I'm really speaking from the perspective of a downstream user, which is agriculture, the agricultural industry, and what some of these recent developments have really meant to producers. I think that Commissioner Goldsmith Romero touched on this a little bit. Commissioner Mercinger also has touched on this, and I know she has a background in agriculture and understands the important symbiotic relationships between energy, environment, and agriculture. And so I think that the key thing that we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years with the pandemic and then the ice storm and then other disruptions in the supply chain, finally culminating with Russia invaded Europe, is just that supply of input. I know that for a lot of your industries, energy is the ultimate output, but it's an input into the agricultural industry, so that supply of those inputs can ultimately affect supply and pricing of output. And how we've really seen that is through the lens of farm finances and how energy as an input has affected both the cost structure for farmers, both from a specific energy standpoint, but also from the fact that natural gas is the #1 input into nitrogen fertilizer, for example. And so what we've seen with fertilizer cost increase has just been extraordinary over the last couple of years. And so, like I said, this had started with the ice storms a couple years ago. I guess in 2021, so last year in February, where we saw a really sharp increase in fertilizer prices as natural gas plants had difficulty keeping up. And really the first kind of loser in that situation, we're also seeing this in Europe as well, is, the primary user are, we want to heat homes with that natural gas. So the first kind of spigot that gets shut, so to speak, is that input into fertilizer. So that increase in cost for producers. So we have seen substantial increases for costs. And as Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero had said, what does that ultimately mean for our production of commodities, both in the US and internationally? For example, we're having really hard weather conditions all over the world. Drought and flooding in China, who's not a big, who is the largest kind of producer and consumer of a lot of agricultural commodities. Drought in countries that are historically dry anyway, such as India. A drought in the US, and really kind of Brazil and Russia have been the only countries that have actually seen pretty good weather this year. But one thing that we're seeing in Brazil is, for the first time in about 10 years, producers are using less inputs, specifically fertilizer. And so what does that mean for kind of the overall production of commodities? And I think that and then moving forward to Russia, so coming into Russia, we were already seeing lower inventories of both agricultural and energy commodities, but especially on the agricultural commodity side, and especially for wheat. Wheat is not as valuable of a crop for producers to produce. So if they can produce soybeans or corn, they typically are in areas that they'll choose to produce those crops. So we've seen kind of a decline in planted acreage and production of wheat, even coming into Russia. So talking about the market fundamentals that affect prices, inventories is a big one. So we were already seeing lower inventories. Russia invaded Ukraine, and in the 2 weeks following that, we saw futures prices for wheat increase 36% just in 2 weeks. And the month-over-month increase in spot prices was the 7th largest on record. And the only years that had eclipsed that level of volatility or that level of price increase was going back to the Dust Bowl or the Russia grain deal in 1973. So these were, I think, really significant changes in commodity prices. And even though they were on the upside for producers, we also saw at the same time very similar increases in cost for production. So on net, moving even closer kind of in the timeline, in September, USDA released their farm income forecast for this year. And so we were all wondering, what was going to net out. So we know that we've seen higher commodity prices, and we know that we've seen higher costs for inputs because of all of these global developments. So what was that net farm income number going to do? And they actually kind of surprised us, because most of what we hear about from agricultural bankers and from producers is concerns about input costs. But what USDA showed us was that net farm income was actually forecast to increase 5% this year. So on net, and the higher commodity prices actually, so to speak, won out a bit over higher input costs. But at the same time, when we track agricultural credit conditions, we've also seen that demand for loans, which had declined a bit over the last couple of years due to government support and higher commodity prices, has started to bounce back. So higher demand for loans, starting to see some expectations falling for regional farm income and for repayment rates. So, and a lot of that is tied to both weather, which we can't control, but also input costs. And another thing that I wanted to mention on the revenue side is, if you look at, so we track ag credit conditions, so farm income, things like repayment rates, farmland values. If you look at repayment rates for farm loans in Oklahoma in particular, there's about a 90% correlation with oil prices. So if you look at WTI oil prices or crude prices, they're highly correlated with farmers in Oklahoma's ability to repay loans. And I think a big reason for that is because a lot of farmers, they're very resource rich. They have a lot of land. They have, they can have mineral contracts with energy companies. And so even though we'll see, maybe farm income decline or other things happen on the crop and input side, what we see in energy markets can actually impact overall credit conditions for some farmers just because of that relationship that they have there. And so I think that the key takeaway is that and one other thing that I wanted to say on the revenue side is that, in this energy transition, I think there will be opportunities for farmers to, to potentially make money, but there are a lot of costs associated with that. Like I said, I had done some research on, and I was talking to Sarah about this yesterday, on carbon capture on, say, swine and dairy farms. But there's a significant cost related to that. And if they don't have good financing or support from the government or a partner that can make a pretty substantial investment in that, it does not work financially for farmers. So, but I think that overall, when thinking about investment in infrastructure, like I said at the beginning, the key takeaway is that the supply of these inputs, ultimately can affect supply of outputs, because if costs get too high, we are hearing anecdotes and seeing the data both in the US and globally that farmers will kind of back off of those inputs a little bit, which then can affect their production of those products. And then we saw in the situation in Russia, if we have lower supplies, lower net inventories, then that can ultimately lead to greater volatility on the commodity prices side moving forward. So I think that, higher supplies gives us kind of a backstop to those supply shocks, because demand overall stays relatively constant. Okay, and that's what I have.
Thank you, Courtney.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your leadership and service on this committee, and I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to spend 10 minutes talking about something that I've worked on for 25 years. It's a little problem called the capacity markets. I work for a FERC commissioner now, Commissioner James Danley, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But before that, I was an electricity lawyer in private practice for 25 years, partner at SCAD, and then Bracewell and non-business. What if you could design a market with the sole purpose of that market being to build more physical energy infrastructure in a way that would avoid price volatility? Wouldn't that be awesome? It would be awesome. And we tried it, and so far it's not really working. They call it a capacity market. They have them all over the country. In the electricity space, they call it a capacity market. I'm going to focus today on New England's capacity market. Capacity markets you're probably all very familiar with, if you're unlucky. But if you have an energy-only market, they tend to be pretty volatile because the price of energy can spike. This energy that we're using right now is actually being produced right now, unless it's coming from some battery. So right now. And that creates a little bit of volatility. A capacity market is a forward market that it's kind of like an option. I hate to use it in any contract terms with people who do hedging for a living, but it's, I'm going to sell this product to you in 3 years. And you price it, it sounds like a great idea, and it should be, and it could be. It creates some of its own issues because they're often designed by stakeholder committees, all of whom have their own goals about what they want to get out of this market. In New England, the area where I want to focus on today, at the time they set up their capacity market, gas was getting cheap. Not New England, of course, because they don't have gas there, but gas generally was cheap. So people were trying to build a lot of natural gas power plants because that was the thing in the future. And they did build a lot of them. But they didn't include the price of the fuel in their capacity contracts because natural gas is a just-in-time kind of delivery system for electricity generators. And if they tried to bid the cost of that fuel in their contracts, they never would have cleared it because it would have been too expensive. So you had a lot of gas generation coming online in New England, but no firm fuel to go with it. And over 10, 15 years, pretty soon, half the New England or more is natural gas. Some of them have firm fuel contracts because they're smart and they're hedging, but most don't, and they're not priced through that market they've set up. So that's the situation that developed. Meanwhile, it's really hard to build gas pipeline in New England. In fact, you can change really hard and say impossible, or you can pick your word of choice. It doesn't happen often. In fact, it's really hard to build big electricity transmission projects in New England. It's really hard to build anything in New England. So you have a situation where you have all this natural gas accumulating in a new pipeline. You got just as many residential users of natural gas as ever, maybe even more. And we're headed for kind of a train wreck here. Meanwhile, states are concerned about global warming and they want to adopt renewable portfolio standards. I love renewables, but there wasn't a lot of analysis when they're adopting these standards by how they would impact existing generation, whether the new renewables would be reliable, dispatchable as new renewables, are they going to be there when we remove them? The simple analogy is the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. They also adopt very aggressive standards, some of these New England states in particular. We want 100% renewables by tomorrow. That's an exaggeration, but it was an expedited transition to renewables. It's expensive to replace your entire generation with renewables in a matter of years, and that's the situation New England's in right now, and other regions in the country. The other issue, and this goes directly to capacity markets and volatility, not to get too complicated, but the renewables that were being developed in New England usually benefited from some sort of subsidy program. And then these new renewable resources would turn around and bid into this clearing market, the capacity market, and they would usually bid zero. Now, I don't need to explain to this room what the effect on the capacity market price is for all the existing generators in that region. They rely on that market when you have a lot of new renewables bidding zero. It creates a market. But this has been sanctioned by FERC, and it actually is current government policy. It kind of flies in the face of Econ 101 for most people who understand markets. But the capacity market we have today is heavily undercut by subsidized renewables. So that's the current situation. We have in New England, again, I'm focusing on New England. This is a common problem in every regional transmission organization market. We have very expensive roads. And New England is because of that lack of physical infrastructure. They have a lot of pipes fitting into that region. And we've actually developed a reliability crisis to go along with it. New England does not have enough power, does not have enough dispatchable power. And this winter, the CEO of ISO New England, which is the regional transmission organization that runs the New England power grid, has warned everyone that they're in a reliability crisis. They have one LNG terminal that they've signed an out-of-market contract with that is super critical. If anything happens to that liquefied natural gas terminal this winter, there's problems in New England. They have some other resources, but they are very thin and they're very worried. And what has caused this? Everything I just said is what's caused this. They don't have enough infrastructure, and the markets they designed to get it have failed because of intervention. The other thing that's happened is we have this Russian invasion of Ukraine. Liquefied natural gas has suddenly become a hot commodity, hotter, especially in Europe. Now, in New England, they've already contracted for the liquefied natural gas. But as my boss, Commissioner Danley, likes to say, unlike the country of Germany, for example, the counterparty on those contracts is usually someone like Germany can print its own money. So if they really want liquefied natural gas, they can probably get it. I don't know if he's right about that one, but I think he does raise a correct thought process. If we start feeling really secure about how much liquefied natural gas we have, when other countries start really wanting it, chances are they're going to get it. There was also an explosion of these. I'm just full of good news. This is why I love my Old Testament prophet doing today. There was also an explosion at the Freeport liquefied natural gas terminal in Texas earlier this year. And I don't know the precise timing, but that's very valuable. And I don't mean economic value, it is, I mean, from a reliability perspective, a very valuable asset, and it's out of service. The point being you all know anything can happen to our critical physical infrastructure at any point, including like a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'll conclude with a couple of broad points, and you can be happy to take questions with the other panelists. In New England, at least, and generally, when you're designing these markets, you need to make sure you have the product you actually want in mind. New England's capacity market is designed to get capacity, which is just a promise to sell energy in the future. What it turns out they really need is capacity with fuel security, but that's not what their product was designed to get. And still, so that's how you end up with lots of natural gas generators without any firm contracts for gas. And no real ability to get those, by the way. They're still way too expensive. They'll never clearly number. The second point is policy choices are great. I said earlier, in a true love renewables, but markets are like swimming pools. Eventually, there's not enough chlorine, and you don't have a swimming pool anymore, you have soup. That's what happens to these markets. If there's too much meddling and the markets aren't allowed to work, they're no longer useful. They're actually getting in the way of a functioning system that can get physical infrastructure built. And I'll stop there and be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much to both Courtney and Paul. And at this time, I would like to open the floor to questions and comments from the associate members on their remarks. Do we have any in the room or in the chat?
Well, I'm not associated.
Oh, well then.
I was just getting a cue.
Oh, okay, okay, sorry.
All right. This is Paul Sissio. Is it okay to talk now?
Yes, please, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the presentations. My organization is 100% manufacturing companies, and the vast majority of them are energy intensive trade exposed, and including nitrogen fertilizer companies. So I identify with the conversation this morning, and they are some of the largest electricity consumers in the United States. And you may not, and another point on this is that these energy intensive trade exposed industries consume about 80% of all of the energy that is consumed by the entire US manufacturing sector. So I'll put things in perspective. And we do have some real serious issues. Currently in natural gas, demand is exceeding supply. And just look at the EIA report for last winter. We had a shortfall of 14.9 BCF a day. That is an enormous shortfall of natural gas. And if you look at what's kind of alarming to us, whether we're nitrogen fertilizer or we're steel or chemicals or plastics, is that the average we need to produce more gas. And demand is accelerating, and we're really concerned about keeping up with the supply demand balances. Currently, inventories of natural gas nationally are 11.3% below the 5-year average, 7.4% below last year. And the second big issue gets to this issue of infrastructure, because we simply are not, from our perspective, building sufficient pipeline capacity to keep up with demand. And this impacts not just natural gas supply, but you cannot have a reliable electric grid without reliable pipeline capacity. So we see growing power capacity issues, concerns on reliability, and we see regional problems today on natural gas pipelines. And specific to that point, I've got manufacturers on Transco that probably will be curtailed this winter. That's how serious it is. We talk about the need to expand manufacturing to supply the new decarbonized world? Well, it takes aluminum and steel and it takes minerals. That's what we do. And if we don't have pipeline capacity and reliable power, we can't really help build the kind of jobs and investment that we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Matt Bacardi, I believe you had a comment or a question.
Sure. Can hear me? I'm trying to get on video. There we go. Just kind of a follow-up comment to the presentation on the New England markets. I have to confess, I was in Burlington, Vermont to hear the discussion with the FERC panel and did not expect to hear that today, but very interesting. So I thought I'd help put it a little bit in perspective, at least from the Commercial Energy Working Group and frankly for, all of our efforts on the committee. First of all, New England is definitely some of the issues that they've had were laid out, but the markets are, New England is its own situation. There's a lot of different markets across the country with respect to electricity and the way they're managed and the issues they face. So I think the question we have to ask, maybe as a threshold thing, is what those are the primary markets. There are electricity products traded in secondary markets that the CFTC has regulation over. So maybe the thinking that goes on here is understanding those markets and how they impact consumers and what's going on in those primary markets is an effort we want to think about going forward. And the fact that that's one regional market and there's a lot of other markets, and we've had discussions on this committee a little bit in this space and how the transition occurred in the past, and I just wanted to put maybe a footnote out there that one of the things that happened was when the markets were developed, the view of the world was that a megawatt was a megawatt, and it traded uniformly. And obviously, with what's happening with policy changes going forward, that model is being challenged, and I think some of the stresses that it's putting on the system are starting to show up. So I think those are just some of the perspectives I wanted to put on the presentation today. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, and I think maybe I'll preface this and then I'll try to end up here in a question maybe for Paul who just spoke. But first of all, I don't think this discussion or this topic can be any more timely. We've been EEMAC meetings, I don't know, for 7 or 8, 9 years now. And this is as timely of a discussion as I think we've had, because what we've seen over the last 18 months, I think what we see going forward in terms of infrastructure and stress on our infrastructure, I don't know if we've ever seen it quite like we have seen today. And we talk a lot about risk in these discussions, and we talk about financial risk, we talk about market risk. Sometimes, like today, we even talk about operational risk. I think what we have right here is a confluence of I can't remember who was going through, but a confluence of a lot of things going on at the same time. And what I think they highlight, if I'm going to use a very technical term, is whack-a-mole risk. And that is where we've spent a lot of time and a lot of policy hours addressing specific items with very little regard to the impact of those solutions in other areas. So the impacts of that end up being where we are today, where we have capacity limitations, capacity constraints. Unfortunately, anytime we have an operational risk, those operational risks always spill over to consumers. Operational risks spill over to our financial markets. Our consumers, at the end of the day, end up paying for it. They have to pay for what I think you heard today is, hey, in New England, they may have to pay for it out of their pocketbook. They might have the lights go off. Their heat might be at risk. And those are some stark reminders of just how tenuous these things are. So I say that simply to remind us that operational risk is there and is here today. We're seeing it. And I will tell you, we avoided the administration was able to avert a railroad strike last week. Well, those railroads are very, very vital to the electric industry. There's still a lot of coal generation in this country. Well, knowing that you've had limited ability by the railroads for the last 18 months or so, it's required more dependence on gas pipelines over the last 18 months. When there's more dependence on one flow of supply, every type of disruption causes we become more sensitive to that disruption. So this summer, I think it was mentioned by Paul that there was an LNG terminal that went down to Freeport. So that caused an immediate spike in natural gas prices. We know that there was more construction on some natural gas pipelines this year. Well, if you're already coal constrained and then you have pipeline maintenance going on, that reduces the number of levers we have as utilities to be able to manage that risk. We're operating in a tighter band than we have historically. Those tighter bands are people more risk, and unfortunately, they equal higher prices for a lot of our customers and our consumers. So I guess my question may be completely unfair, but how do we time this energy transition appropriately? I'm back to the whack-a-mole list. How do we make the timing work? How do we build pipeline capacity fast enough to keep up with the energy transition when we're reducing some of our previous baseload fuels and we're expanding our non-dispatchable assets? So we need more reliance on gas pipelines in order to maintain the integrity of the grid. So I know that's a loaded question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I've only been doing this 25 years, so I don't have an answer yet. No, I think a lot of it is actually for the policy people to really communicate with each other. I think we're all often listening by each other. There's the renewable crowd who are really concerned about global warming. They want renewables, and that's fair. I understand that perspective. And then there's kind of the crowd that's more focused on reliability. And we have these existing resources that have worked well for us. We still have a lot of them. They're less expensive. From my own perspective, and I should have said this earlier, I'll say it now, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself, not anyone else. But from my own perspective, there needs to be more communicating with each other about what realistic goals we can reach that will also maintain reliability at low cost. Transitioning out of the entire generations within the New England, for example, that's expensive. You just got to think that. That's going to cost a lot of money. I think another thing that would be useful would be, and this may be legislation, and I'm not sure if legislation is possible, but it really is nearly impossible to build big gas pipelines in certain parts of the country. And something has to be done about that. New England's problem can only be solved by replacing all the gas generation, building more pipeline or more LNG terminals. That's it. And I'm not sure how those things get built without some kind of legislative action.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Bob Anderson with the Committee of Chief Risk Officers, and I just thought I'd jump in and break the Paul pattern that's happening. We've seen Paul writing, Paul Cecile, and Paul Hughes of all. So I'm a Bob, and I thought I'd. Also, thanks, Paul, for the rock and roll. I'm going to go with Jane, pull the blocks out from the tower. As CCRO, risk professionals, we're spending a lot of time on several working groups talking about basically what does the transition look like, or what would a sustainable transition look like? And what we're trying to bring to the table is simply data and best practice methods that might support that in a way that would be clear to everybody involved. And I couldn't agree more with Paul's in that the one thing I can say in this committee is the group certainly sees that there needs to be a balanced perspective on infrastructure investment. On one hand, related to the renewables and the new aspects of the transition, but at the same time, there needs to be continued investment in the traditional energy infrastructure as well, somewhat to Paul's point. And probably the best thing that we would mention is if regulators can be consistent and kind of neutral in terms of the metrics and the approaches that they're pursuing when they think about infrastructure investment, we'll probably end up with a fairly balanced investment portfolio. So for risk officers, if it's all one side or the other, things tend to get, like Paul said, a little wacky for risk professionals, where volatility can make things very difficult for energy companies. So we really just want to encourage that sort of consistent method in thinking about what drives infrastructure investment.
Sarah, I think I'm going to ask you to close it out for the associate members to try to keep us on track here on our timing, and then we'll move to the EMAC members. Sarah?
Sure, and thank you. This is, as I agree with Paul, it's a timely issue, it's an important issue. And like Matt, I attended the conference, but I didn't attend, I listened to the full day conference that FERC put on, and it was extremely interesting on New England's current issues. You know, they focused on short term, medium term, and long term. And, you know, I heard midterm, medium term, there are some opportunities for pipeline expansions, not necessarily greenfield, but some expansions that would bring on new capacity. And I will add to the issues that Paul put in the room, that there is one issue with how generators use pipeline capacity. They use it, you know, 8 hours a day, sometimes shorter, versus like an LDC or a produced by itself to generally shift radically across the way. So they're pulling on the system much harder than we are, and that does create a need for more flexibility, which is becoming scarce and more scarce as there's more usage of those pipelines. So we do need some added infrastructure in the midterm. But long term, you know, BP does believe in the transition. We are investing heavily in products that like offshore wind, carbon sequestration, hydrogen development that hopefully will reduce emissions. And this infrastructure that we're looking at, the gas infrastructure, can be repurposed over time. You know, we are also a heavy developer of renewable natural gas, as well as we're reducing our emissions in producing natural gas, you know, products you might call certified natural gas. So there are ways to reduce your emissions with using important infrastructure that needs to be built.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to the EMAC associate members. At this time, I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments from the EMAC members on the remarks we heard earlier. And so far, I have Tyson and Jackie who have indicated a willingness, desire to speak. So Tyson, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Commissioner, thanks so much for getting us out of Washington, D.C. and bringing us to Oklahoma. It's my first time here, and I've had nothing but warm hospitality and great time. So thank you very much. I think it's always important to broaden our perspectives. So thank you. And I want to thank the presenters. I've got a couple of questions. First, Courtney, your presentation was thorough, and I'm very appreciative. You talked about really issues with natural gas and its impact on the agricultural community. After we spoke to some students yesterday, one of them caught up to me on my way to my car, and she talked about how her family operates a cattle ranch in southwestern Oklahoma, and that they are just plagued with commodity problems. A lot of it is gas driven, and she was having a conversation with her father, especially in light of the class that she's taking. And she said that her dad said, the markets aren't making a whole lot of sense these days. So you talked about the impact of weather on commodities, especially gas, and the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Is there another issue that is also going on here that is the transformation of domestic natural gas markets, right? We, in 2011, became the largest natural gas producer in the world, as folks like BP and others know. And this year, we became the largest exporter of gas. And when we talk about the domestic price increases, this has had profound impacts on our domestic markets. And so could you speak just a little bit about the weather issues? You talk about Winter Storm Uri, the ice storm, and whether or not climate change is producing more frequent and extreme weather events that are disrupting all sorts of commodity markets, not just gas. Global events like war that because of our exports, for the first time in American history, our domestic natural gas benchmarks are directly linked to global climates. Prior to the export boom, we were insulated, correct? Our natural gas prices bore no impact on what was going on in China or Europe. Today, they are directly. And in fact, when the Freeport facility went down, natural gas prices went down in the United States. Hey, because the traders were like, hey, we don't have to compete with Germany or others. American producers like Calpine and others can more easily get gas. So that didn't really sound like a question. There's a lot of comment in there, my apologies, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're thinking about this is exactly how we've been kind of having discussions with, our energy economists. We actually are working on a paper on the impacts of drought on cattle markets in particularly. So it is an important issue. And so I have looked at this issue of over time. So I'll take your climate question first, because that's the one that I've looked at the most in the data. And so if you look at measures of drought, we have measures of drought in the US going back 100 years. So the Palmer Drought Index takes in a lot of hydrological data and then determines the level of drought or, or wetness in the. And so what we can see is over time, there are certain areas of the US that have gotten drier. And there are other areas of the US that have gotten wetter. And then some just kind of have stayed the same. Like Missouri, is an example of a state that's actually gotten wetter over time. And of course, if you go west of the Rocky Mountains, that's an area that's had probably in the last 15 years, their highest frequency of drought in the last 100 years and the most intense droughts that they've had in the last 100 years. So if you think about like what that means in terms of agriculture, like a farmer in California will say, variable weather leads to variable yields, and that variable yields can lead to more volatility in the market. So I think that weather has definitely made things harder for producers and more difficult from a marketing perspective, because we do get into these periods where we're in what analysts will call the weather market in the United States. And so for a long time, Russia was kind of driving things up, and then we got into the weather market and commodity prices came back down a little bit and are always trying to get a sense of where yields are going to be. Now, more from a global perspective, I think this is where it gets really interesting for farmers, because when we think about, supply, we're really good at producing agricultural commodities in the United States, no matter what it is. We produce high quality, we produce a lot, but we don't have the demand in the US to meet that supply. So if we didn't have global markets, producers would be getting paid almost nothing for what they produce. So from an agricultural producer perspective, I think globalization has been really beneficial because it has increased demand to help meet the supply that we have. Now, though, from an input perspective, higher demand for the products that they need, that can potentially cause some stress, especially when you have these huge shocks to the supply chain that we've seen here recently. So I can understand how, the example you gave that, we can't figure out what's going on in commodity markets, because part of that is, I think, a reason you didn't say, and it's, investment kind of outside the agricultural, space, whether it be like, speculation or just, other types of investment that, may not be solely driven by supply and demand fundamentals as we traditionally think about. I think that's been something else that has made things a little more difficult on the producer side.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
And I don't want to hog the mic. I've got a question for Paul, but if there's others in the meantime, if not, I'll jump in. Me.
We have a question from Jackie, so let me take that, if that's okay, Tyson, and then I'll come back to you. Jackie, do you want to go ahead? Jackie, you're on mute if you're trying to speak to us.
Jackie, try again. There you go. Now try. We still can't hear you. If you want to type your question in the chat.
Tyson, why don't you go ahead and then we'll see if we can come back to Jack.
All right, I am looking forward to hearing from Jack. So Paul, thank you very much for your comments. Anytime folks talk about New England, my ears perk up. I'm a native New Englander. Grew up in Rhode Island. My father enlisted in the Navy in 1959, served 5 combat tours in Vietnam, and was transferred to the War College in Fort Rhode Island. So I was very privileged to grow up in a great place, and my parents still live there. So I get back as much as I can. You talk about renewables and subsidies, and that was a potential problem for capacity markets. Do fossil fuels receive any subsidies? Does the federal government, for example, regulate greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel generation?
Yes.
The federal government regulates greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas and coal power plants?
Well, I was answering the first question. Maybe I missed the second question. The question is, do they receive subsidies of some sort? Yes.
Yeah. So to isolate renewables as a generation resource that receives subsidies, without talking about basket of subsidies that other generation units provide, might give an incomplete picture of, how different generation units operate and where they get subsidies at different points in the supply chain.
Sure. Yeah, this might be part of the issue I was talking about where I was mentioning people who kind of talk past each other. That point is absolutely the case. Very few large infrastructure projects don't receive some sort of tax credit or government help.
Right.
No question. But it's also the case that the New England capacity market was flooded with new renewables bid zero. And the effect on that market for every existing resource is predictable. So my solution would be we should always kind of recognize these realities, talk to each other, and try to find a market that actually works, that recognize any stuff, any subsidy, or any tax credit.
Right. So we've got market participants like Alpine and BP that have significant investments across the board in renewables, in energy storage, in fossil fuels. And so it seems like there are market participants that are not just all in on renewables, all in on fossil fuels, but there are some extremely successful market participants that, are invested in all aspects of the market. Now, the challenges with New England, you talked about that it's got high prices. New England has had higher retail electric prices for as long as I can remember, prior to the structure. Right, during the 1990s, as you and others know, we underwent a radical transformation of our electricity markets for some regions, not here in Oklahoma, but elsewhere, mainly in result to high prices. And the thought was if we introduced competition markets and replaced the vertically integrated generation systems, that we would have, lower prices. And that clearly hasn't happened. And it seems like you're saying, well, it's because they're not getting the market right. But I think I wasn't at the FERC meeting in Vermont, but record exports out of Maine of natural gas have never been higher. So New England is sending higher volumes of gas out of the region into Canada. I don't know if that was something that was discussed. But again, getting back to the conversation with Courtney, if you build more pipeline capacity in New England to try and tether it more closely to the Marcellus Shale, those natural gas prices are not going to be based upon the marginal costs of what's going on in the Marcellus Shale. They're going to be priced according to what is going on in Ukraine, what is going on in China. And to have a lower price impact ignores the fact that our exports have reconfigured domestic pricing. And the assumptions that the Department of Energy gives in authorizing these exports is that production will keep pace with the pace of exports, therefore keeping a lid on prices. But that's not what's happening, right? What's happening is you're seeing capital discipline by the domestic fracking industry, both the oil side, Continental and BP nodes, and on the gas side. So they are actually holding back on production because they sort of like the higher prices that they're able to get for their product. So I think when it all is said and done, the role of exports here seems to be the defining characteristic that is really upending a lot of the problems. Building more domestic pipeline capacity is not going to address the problem of shifting benchmarks that expose the United States to global calamities. Again, I'm sorry that turned into a comment and less of a question. My apologies, but you want to respond or add?
I don't disagree with any of that. I think in New England, the current issue we face is on the coldest winter days, there's not enough gas. I don't know if they can do anything about the main exports this winter to solve that. They're not talking about it. They don't know what they can do. And in their case, they want more pipeline on the lines and terminals, or they want some of this oil to be back and more ships. They're desperate. But long term or longer term, I think there isn't some excellent moves.
Shall we try Jackie again?
Try Jackie again.
Jackie, are you able to get online here?
Jackie, we still can't hear you, so we're going to go to Bill and then try to get back to you after you get home.
Bill?
Yes, thank you. Bill McCoy at Morgan Stanley. And first, Commissioner Mercer, thank you very much for not just sponsoring the EMAC, but having the first meeting outside of the walls of the commission, and for the hospitality that Oklahoma State has offered. And I'd like to thank our presenters for two excellent presentations, both Courtney and Paul. Actually, I have a question for Courtney because I was just wondering, anecdotally, one hears about, well, first you mentioned revenues and the different challenges, but the revenues that farmers, members of the agricultural community may pursue. And anecdotally, one hears about how farmers will make choices sometimes with shale production or even renewables, wind farms, to lease their property for that purpose. Would that be a significant impact in the levels of production in the agricultural community, or just, as I said, anecdotal?
So, that is a good question. Because whenever you look at, especially wind farms, they can take up a lot of space in a field. And in Oklahoma, where we see those a lot are on pasture land, cattle, because Oklahoma actually doesn't have the best land quality that we have in the United States. So taking out however many acres that you need for a wind farm may not reduce your forage production as much as, say, it would if you were in the I-states in Iowa or something like that. So it is beneficial for them, the offset revenue that they might see from taking away that land to produce extra cattle, they make up for with their wind energy leases. And I think it's even easier on the oil and gas side because those don't take up as much space, and they can get a benefit from that. So I think that for most of the farmers I've talked to that have done this, really it's just what is in the lease agreement and how does it does it fully offset the potential revenues from the lost production that they could get? I think that that's certainly a consideration and one that they usually try to make up for in their contracts. Luckily, luckily, I think where we have wind in the country is just so happens to be in the least productive areas. So I think that does help.
Yeah.
So Courtney, I wanted to come back to what you made earlier, that despite input costs going up, we saw the underlying price of the export or sold agricultural market itself was more than offset. We were the world's largest ag business. We saw exactly the same thing. We actually saw, interestingly, it's a little counterintuitive. People think that as the price of the market goes up, everybody immediately hedges it and sells forward. Well, when beans went from 8 to 13, we actually saw commercial hedgers pull back. Not directly in our own market alone, we saw some portion of that, but we actually saw, we were visiting the largest agricultural commodity processor in the US, and they've got a program called pro pricing where they have much farmer incentive pricing to centralize hedge forward, and they saw 50% reduction in the farmers themselves hedging through them, because why would I want to sell beans 8 to 10 when we went to 13? So we actually didn't see start that hedging until the price came back and started to drop back off. Not unusual. So I think this is the reason why farmers are getting smarter and not just selling forward because they've got the product now, seeing their input costs going up, managing and optimizing how they're hedging their portfolios. So we did see some pullback in end user hedging until the price came off the high. So beans off 13 or beans off 18, wheat off 12.5 or 13 back these levels now. So we actually, they were riding that price up, saw the high came back, and we're selling into the price coming off the high. So we saw that in direct participation in our markets, commercial hedgers, as well as through the agribusinesses that manage their own portfolio and on behalf of farmers themselves. So I think that the way that our farmers are interacting with and offsetting the input costs is optimizing the sales of the product is what we saw that trend. And that surprised a lot of people that we actually saw commercial pullback when we saw the prices rise, because they want to make sure they would capture that rise in the underlying exportable feed they can export, they can capture by selling once they do actually took the high brand up.
Yeah, I think that farmers learned a lot in that 2012, 2013 period when prices came up, and then in the next kind of downturn in agriculture. I think they learned a lot about hedging that it sounds like you can see now. And that's one of the questions we always have whenever we see these price spikes is who's taking advantage of this, who's forward contracting and using that. So that's really interesting. And I'm glad that it did match up to kind of what USDA had reported.
Maybe the third or the fourth time is a charm. Jackie, let's try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. What's up?
Thank you, CFTC tech team. Work this out. This is really an interesting discussion, and I think the natural gas discussion, really could help with some context, because I was in a natural gas company in-house when New England, New Hampshire at that time had one source of gas, one pipeline source of gas from Tenneco out of the Gulf. That was a lot of years ago, and now there are other pipelines that help supply New England. I think back to the polar vortex, and in PJM, where I practice the most now, the problem wasn't just that we had natural gas issues. It was that the electric generators did not have firm gas, or they had firm gas and didn't do the maintenance on their generators to be able to switch gas to meet the demands of the grid. That, I think, has been largely resolved. But I remember my comments at one of the very first CFTC meetings, EEMAC meetings I attended, which was there's a real disconnect between the regulation of natural gas and the regulation of electricity. It wasn't that long ago you could not use natural gas to produce electricity. It was the law. It was only for residential heating and cooling and manufacturing. And so that has changed. And at the same time, we have the supplies of the shale gas. And you're right, the pipeline system hasn't caught up for political and economic reasons. It's expensive and takes a long lead time to get those pipelines in. I will say in West Virginia, where we have a lot of the shale gas, the entire southern part of West Virginia, and by that I mean just about everything but Morgantown, still uses Gulf gas. We do not have access to shale gas. Now there's a pipeline coming in that I think, will solve that. But I think one of the issues is the electric gas coordination. FERC has been doing a lot of work on that, but they don't have really the authority, I don't think, to do the kind of regulation they do in the electric industry. The transition is critical for low carbon. And I think the CFTC is going to be involved in that. As Paul said, FERC Paul said, one of the issues for the transition is the balance between intermittent renewable resources and base load, which isn't just natural gas, it's also coal and nuclear. And to the extent we keep closing coal, we're going to have a really hard time with this transition. And you're seeing that in MISO and some other RTOs. I see at PJM, their queue, their interconnection queue, is about 70,000 megawatts of renewable clean resources, intermittent resources. And their peak has been at about 165,000 megawatts. So you just look at those numbers and there's going to be a problem. And when I hear people saying we're going to have 70,000 megawatts of intermittent resources on our system, coming from a coal state, my view is bring it on, because you can't bring it on without coal, nuclear, and natural gas to balance that. My question for Paul and the board, the commissioners, is Paul mentioned the 3-year forward capacity market. PJM has the 3-year forward capacity market, which is where you're buying the ability to buy energy in the future. And several RTOs and ISOs want to combine that with the clean energy attribute market, which would then be a 3-year forward market. At what point does the CFTC, who has exclusive jurisdiction over that kind of market, step in and work with FERC and say, we have a memorandum of understanding, we have an order, and we've seen how that played out with FTRs, probably not real well. At what point are we going to look at the future capacity market, including clean air attributes
On the actual jurisdictional question, a lot of the markets have financial trading rights or some sort of forward hedge. My opinion, again, Paul White talking, anonymous before, FERC's not very good at regulating these things compared to the CFTC. A lot of people don't even understand what a hedge is. That would be shot on the street for saying that, but we're not the best regulating that in my opinion. That's just a Paul White comment.
Well, and speaking for myself, not the CFTC, but I do hope that is something we can work on in this committee. Is that's part of the reason that we've had outreach with FERC, and I think it's important that the regulators work together, and that's part of why invited Paul and Courtney to come and speak to us today, because I think there is an opportunity for more conversation between the regulators, something we don't do a lot in Washington that we need to do more of, is kind of work together and talk about these issues. So on the jurisdiction side, I know we have our MOU, but nothing should be static, and we should always be looking for more opportunities to kind of discuss and reevaluate where we work together. So hopefully we can do that as part of the committee work. So, and thanks again for coming out here, Paula. It was a you know, it's great to have the connection with FERC, but it's also great to see folks willing to kind of come out and be a part of this. So thank you.
I think we have a comment or a question from Rob Kramer. And Rob, if you just make sure that you speak up and speak directly into your microphone or your phone or however you're communicating with us.
I am speaking through my computer's microphone. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, this is thank you. This is Rob Kramer. I am chairman of the FIA's Principal Traders Group. And, you know, when we looked at, you know, the capital rules, the leverage ratios, the SLR back, you know, when things were being proposed and implemented, I forecasted that at a point in time, market makers and participants in the market would have the potential to reach capacity at a time when markets need liquidity the most. And I certainly, I can't speak to the power market specifically, but looking at crude markets, oil markets globally, as well as any other markets, commodity markets, which, you know, have a heavier or impacted more heavily from SACR, the FCM supporting those markets really do have clear constraints on the amount of balance sheet that they can provide for what we would regard as fairly riskless transactions in the market. And there were times that my firm had to withdraw from the active engagement in providing liquidity into commodity markets simply because we met what I would regard as somewhat of an arbitrary capital limit that was imposed. And I wonder, you know, and I understand the intent of that, and I'm not saying it's not a valuable tool, but this is a byproduct that was intended, I believe, to curb speculation that is actually affecting liquidity providers in the market. And what you would see is volatility increases in these markets as prices start to really rally and reach extreme prices. It becomes more and more balance sheet intensive, and liquidity could degrade, markets widen even further. And I don't know whether individuals involved in this group are studying that. I certainly don't have a behind the scenes look from like the markets like Derek Salmon would have at CME of what sort of behaviors were we seeing. But I can speak to my own personal experiences and those that I've heard from other market participants that engage in these in the commodity markets. And I just wanted to point that out, that as the comment was made earlier, we look at whack-a-mole solutions. There are a lot of factors at play. And this is one that I'm kind of passionate about because it, to me as a market maker, it's frustrating to feel like we have a vital role in these markets. We can engage and we're unable to, and our risk department has no problem with the risks that we're putting on. And in fact, that hasn't increased. It's simply something that's happening behind the scenes with a bank FCM that impacts our ability to engage. So I'll leave it on that. It's not a question. I'm just putting it out there for everyone to consume.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah.
Yeah, Rob, I'm glad you raised that point, Derek Salmon. You're right. I think we've long been concerned about the capital requirements imposed on particularly bank FCMs and constraints that creates. Certainly, there's an optimal frontier between raising margin and making sure that there's enough collateral in the system for the safe passage and transfers of risk between makers and takers. We did see during the elevated times, whether it was crude, whether it was natural gas, whether it was copper, whether it was beans, wheat, corn, any of this with commodities, we saw elevated levels of margins, which has some de facto real impact of deleveraging that obviously has an impact on folks. We did see that replicated to a higher degree by the FCMs themselves. So exchange margins or exchange minimums are put out to the FCMs. We saw elevated levels of capital that the FCMs were requiring from end user customers like Rob's firm and actually PPG overall, and actually even commercial firms as well. And when you think about that, that deleverages the system, that removes folks from the ecosystem at the point in time as Rob's point, we need that most. So it is a concern. I think that what's behind that is a well-intentioned plan to make sure there's enough capital in the system. I think banking laws and certainly what we saw in terms of the sector and other legislative measures that had a real impact on firms being able to participate in markets, that had a knock-on effect. And I think we certainly saw that as well. So if you think about that in its most extreme, it deleverages the point of removes participants from the participant pool exactly when you need that risk transfer mechanism at its site. So Rob, I'm glad you raised the point. We saw that. Again, we raised margins in line with the elevated levels of risk out there, which is what you need us to do, running the central counterparty. We did see that increase in leverage by many bank FCM to the point where it did start to impact customers' ability to participate.
Just to quickly jump on this, I appreciate this, but now we're getting sort of to the heart of CFTC jurisdictional issues. And, as you know, I wrote a letter to the CFTC back in March when the request for financial assistance for some of these traders to European officials in light of the significant volatility, particularly in crude oil prices at the time. And they were complaining that these capital requirements were inhibiting their ability to effectively participate as FCMs and other types of parties. But the purpose of those capital requirements is to make sure that these commodity markets don't become overly leveraged. Once they become overly leveraged, then bigger systemic problems can occur. And we all know what happened in 2008. That wasn't necessarily with commodities, but it was an over-leveraged system. And Rob, I appreciate that from your perspective, these crude oil markets are relatively riskless. I think that there is a lot of inherent risk given the significant unknown variables that are, or the significant variables that are affecting volatility right now. We saw what happened in April 2020 with WTI. That was on no one's radar screen. It happened very quickly. And the smartest traders with the deepest experience can be caught flat-footed when we've got the kind of unexpected variables that are affecting volatility. And so I think I understand that the capital requirements sometimes makes you miss some opportunities, but the alternative is introducing systemic risk when we absolutely cannot afford it. And as volatile as these commodity markets have been, there have not been massive failures because of these capital requirements, right? So they are protecting against systemic risk, which is one of the core, actions that the CFTC can continue to take. Thank you.
I just wanted to put something in the room on the discussion about the natural gas markets. I'm speaking here, obviously, as a member of EEMAC and taking off my chair hat for just a few seconds here. I just wanted to put these statistics in the room that according to Platts, the production of natural gas today is supposed to be about 95.6 BCF. And just for context, to put that in perspective, nationally, 2022 production thus far is about 3.2 BCF a day higher than it was in 2021. And September 22 production is 3 BCF a day on average higher than September of 2021. So just to sort of underscore the point that there is a market response, the producers are responding and production is going up. Are there any other comments from EMAC members? I'm not seeing any. Are there, or do any of the commissioners have a question or comment?
I see that Dimitri has a hand up, but I don't know Rob.
Yeah, Dimitri.
Hi, sorry, I might have gotten that in a little late, but thank you. Again, I would very quickly like to thank Commissioner Mersinger for putting this together and echoing her comments about the need to bring in some of the other regulators like the Fed and the FERC. I think these are pretty complex problems, as we're all discovering here. Just a couple comments in response to the discussion that we've heard. I would like to remind everyone, I see the experience from 2008, 2009 quite differently. The crisis that we saw was actually by and large outside of the markets regulated by the CFTC, and the recognition that CFTC jurisdictional markets like exchanges and clearinghouses actually were the one place of safety during that time, because we did not in fact see or have the problem of daisy chaining that occurred in all the bilateral trading that happened in the MBS and credit default swap markets. And so therefore the G20, for example, recommended that as much forward trading as possible be done on exchange cleared markets. And so I just want to make sure we have perhaps a different perspective on the learnings and experience from the 2008, 2009 crisis. And I too want to echo that maybe now is a time to reevaluate perhaps some of the SACR rules, in particular, with particular reference to some of the energy commodities. The figures used do seem a bit arbitrary, and it may be a good time to review those levels, realizing that that's more in the Fed's purview, but worth echoing because the last thing I think we want to see is bank FCMs being pressured from capital requirements, encouraging market participants to drive their business into bilateral trading rather than continue them in the relatively safe exchange cleared marketplace. So I think we want to make sure we're not leading to that kind of unintended consequence. With regards to the underlying energy infrastructure questions, the fascinating discussion, really glad to be part of it and hearing it. My earliest days in the workplace were in the energy business in the natural gas space. So it's fun to see how it's still critical and vital these markets are. Just a couple rules of thumb that I tend to fall back on. Whenever we talk about perhaps markets failing, often it's because there aren't enough markets. So one way to think about that is that the price mechanism is an incredibly powerful force, one of the most powerful forces known to man. And when we don't have certain key commodities effectively priced, then sometimes we lead to market failure. So one thing that, again, not within the power or control of anyone here, but that we should perhaps be encouraging are nationwide markets directly in some of these key attributes and products that we care about, like carbon, but also security and reliability. So those are perhaps markets that we would like to see developed. And of course, as an exchange, I would be happy to provide forward markets on. And in addition to the criticality of infrastructure, I do want to just emphasize that another piece of the puzzle, of course, is distributed energy. And so to the degree that we're not talking about necessarily, as our country looks forward at its energy path, relying on the old model of concentrated energy production and transmission and distribution, which of course is important and critical, but also leveraging as much as possible distributed solutions so that we put less stress and strain on that infrastructure to deliver that energy. So thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Rob Kramer, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to respond to Tyson's comment or response to what I was saying there. So, and I totally understand what the intention was, and I think we can wave this evil flag of speculation and point to everything about how speculation is what we're trying to solve and avoid real fundamental problems with the way these calculations are impacting real players in the market. So for Tyson and everyone else in the room, to make this very clear, if you trade, and I'll just make a very simple scenario, and I won't go into all the mechanics, but if you trade a crude swap that we will assume, and in fact, in practice does, settles to a defined point that matches that of futures. And I go in and I buy $100 million of a crude swap and sell simultaneously a portfolio of futures that exactly replicates that on the other side. I don't care any scenario that Tyson's talked about, price volatility, things that are happening, forecasting what's happening in the world. That cost my bank FCM an enormous amount of balance sheet, despite the fact that it doesn't have risk. And the problem is the contract specs for those two products aren't exactly the same. They aren't the same thing, but their risk profile is. So depending on how you're making markets to participants, and you can move away from the perfect arbitrage situation into 99% correlated products where market makers are expert at managing risk and hedging portfolios to avoid unexpected price volatility and movement in the market. And it is those providers that I'm speaking for that aren't concerned with, or certainly don't want to take advantage of radical price volatility. They want to provide liquidity to end users who want to hedge their portfolios, and they want to do it efficiently. And that's what I'm speaking to. But I do understand the point that it's hard to forecast those things.
Back to the commissioners. Do we have any comments or questions from the commissioners? Right. Thank you, everyone, for the conversation and the questions and the comments. Based on the panel discussion on physical energy infrastructure and the effects on the commodities market, is there a motion from an EEMAC member that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to physical energy infrastructure and the effects on commodity markets?
I'd like to make that motion.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. It has been moved and properly seconded that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to physical energy infrastructure and the effects on the commodity markets. At this time, I will open the floor to questions and comments from the associate members. Are there any questions or comments from associate members? I will now open the floor to questions and comments from the EEMAC members. Are there any questions or comments from any of the EEMAC members? Rob, your hand is up. Is that from your earlier comment?
Yes, it was. I'm sorry. I will lower that.
That's fine. Just didn't want to overlook you if you had something you wanted to say.
Thank you.
Not seeing any questions or comments, we'll now take a vote on the motion that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to physical energy infrastructure and the effects on the commodity markets. As a point of order, a simple majority vote of the 9 present EEMAC members is necessary.
Thank you, Dina. EEMAC members, when I call your name, please indicate your agreement with aye, disagreement with nay, or indicate your abstention from the vote. Please remember to unmute yourself and indicate your vote, and then mute your audio once you are done voting. Group Land, ICE Futures US.
Can you unmute yourself?
I will let the record show that member Bland votes aye.
The thumbs up.
With a thumbs up. Rob Kramer of APTG. Rob, are you there?
Yes, sorry.
Your vote on the subcommittee?
Yes, I approve or Support.
Aye. Rockinger votes aye.
Aye.
3, Chief Caruso's, no vote change LLC.
Aye.
Chief Caruso's votes aye. William McCoy, Morgan Stanley.
Aye.
William McCoy votes aye. Local Creek Edison Electric Institute.
Is abstaining an option?
Yes.
Okay, abstain.
Local Creek abstains. Jackie Roberts, Public Service Commission of West Virginia.
Aye.
Jackie Roberts votes aye. Derek Salmon, CME Group.
Aye.
Derek Salmon votes aye. Tyson Slocum, Public Citizen.
Aye.
Tyson Slocum votes aye. Dina Wiggins, National Gas Supply Association. Aye. Dina Wiggins votes aye. Madam Chair, you have 8 yes votes, no votes, and 1 abstention.
Thank you, Lauren. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The recommendation to form an EMAC subcommittee to provide a report to the EMAC on fiscal energy infrastructure and the effects on the commodity markets has been adopted and will be submitted to the commission for its consideration.
Great. At this time, the EMAC will take a 10-minute break. We will resume again at 11:15. I would like to call the EMAC meeting back to order and turn the agenda back over to Dina.
Thank you, Lauren. Our second panel today will discuss exploring the role of the metals markets as components in transitional energy sources and the potential impact on financial markets. You will hear a presentation.
So thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Mersinger, for reconstituting EMAC to, I think, look beyond just the world of energy, as we've spoken about before. Many of us have discussed together. This world of energy and ags and metals no longer exists in virtual silos anymore. Everything that we've discussed here so far today is indicative of energy as an input into many things, as well as an output as the end product, as well as a source of inputs and cost drivers in our businesses. We see this in our customer base. We see this in trading patterns. Case in point, for the first time this year, one of our top 5 customers in our ag business is actually an energy company. That should not surprise. And it's emblematic of the barriers that are sort of degrading between each of these vertical spheres of businesses. I think it's important that we gather as an industry under the leadership of a regulator to talk about what that means for the industry, talk about the implications, and understand that, and help us as an industry see run more and manage better through this throughout. Courtney, I especially appreciate your comments speaking from an ag lens. I think it's really important that the conversation we'll have today about the blending of markets between metals and energy is absolutely happening in ag as well. There's biofuels, there's corn, there's ethanol, renewables, used cooking oil. These markets are blending into one another. I think in powerful and powerful ways, we understand that trying to regulate these, trying to look at these, trying to run these the way we've always looked at our businesses in vertical silos isn't going to work in a world in which energy transition is flowing through every one of these asset classes, and customers are being impacted above it by the ups and downs and price volatility of every one of these individual asset classes. As we heard in the setup for a great deal of focus in the energy transition has been on energy itself. And I think we've been missing an important part of this discussion, which are what the inputs that will enable this transition. How quick can this happen? Is there enough underlying supply for the material, the physical commodities that feed into this? So we're going to talk a little bit today about the significant increase in demand for metals that will be required for the energy transition that all of us envision, maybe to slightly different degrees and maybe on slightly different timelines. But the underlying component pieces of any sort of sustainable future runs through metals. And it's not a conversation we hear much of, but we run the largest private metal business in the world. Now we've got a growth in our base metal business as well. And so we have a review in that. And again, same way we're seeing large energy customers move into ag, we're seeing that barrier limited distinction as cobalt, lithium, and nickel. Are they actually base metals or are they energy components? So we're seeing a lot more of that. We're going to specifically talk about copper, aluminum, steel, and battery metals and some of the implications of that. And really, while EVs, electric vehicles, dominate the headline in this kind of conversation, the investments in infrastructure asset, as we talked about in the previous panel, electrical storage systems, renewable generation facilities, all limits the need for industrial metals, that they are all critical components. And some of these are not in wide supply, and some of these come from sources that are concerning. So be cognizant of that as this transition moving forward. We pre-circulate these materials. There's a lot in here. It's super dense. I'm going to try to call out a couple of local observations here without forcing everyone to do a page on the materials, but I'm also a visual learner, so I love to see chart to help me understand and visualize what we're talking about here. So since we are talking about the transition and role that metals will play in that, the obvious place to start is around electric vehicles. And what does that look like? What does the last 10 years of EVs look like? And what does the next 10 to 30 years look like in terms of where the transition is going to go? We've taken a graph here from the IEA data and pulling all of the plug-in hybrids and battery vehicles across China, Europe, US, and other, and just stack those up and kind of look at that chart. As much as that looks like a hockey stick, wait till you model that out 10 years and 15 years and 20 years. And some of the stats in there are pretty eye-popping. If you look at the 15 million units on the road right now, that represents 1% of the global car fleet. The US EIA projects that will go to 31% of global stock by 2050. And the world that is not static in population growth, we're certainly going to see a growing proportion of a growing middle class growing their use of EVs over time. Similarly, the IEA estimates that by 2030, this is really terrifying. Under a net zero scenario, important caveat, under that net zero scenario, 50% of new car sales could be EV to plug-in hybrids, versus less than 5% today. So the burgeoning demand, we know this demand is coming. Some of the stats and some of the graphs I'll show you should give us all pause in terms of where does the material going to come from? How can we safely procure it? What does it mean for national and international security in some of these markets? What do we need to ask ourselves? So this is a growth area, and I have no economic interest in trying to convince you this is true. This is where the data is pointing at. So as a provider of risk management tools, we're simply working with our customers to say, what does this mean for new management needs? What kind of price volatility should we expect? Where is this going to come from? And how global is this market going to be? Because there's no one single country that has enough of all the required component pieces to nationalize this, but all countries will make that a point of national security. So that's food for thought for all of us. Cool slide. This is one of our favorite slides. It gets a lot of play. We typically use this when we're pitching our exchange. Hey, you can come to the senior group and you can hedge tax. All component parts you can hedge. That's not the point of today. The point of today is running through this, and we talked about the EV demand and what that means for the source of industrial metals. Start on the left-hand side, batteries. The rare earth markets right now, the battery, primarily cobalt, but also nickel sulfate. Platinum, palladium also play a role in the EV world. When you look at the typical EV, it's going to require already does require roughly 3 times as much copper as an internal combustion engine. So just the copper market, there's going to be a massive increase in demand. So much switching, so much electrical systems run through these things. Copper is a critical component piece to that. Bodywork, aluminum and steel. The average amount of aluminum used in EV is 30% higher than an internal combustion car. It's lighter, and it certainly is more fuel efficient. There are a lot of reasons that are driving that. So we make a larger proportion of our rolling stock. When you look at that fleet number go from 1% to 6 or 5% to 60% by 2030, that has significant implications for where you can source the material and who's going to get their hands on that less cars. Electrical circuits. This is both for copper and silver. I mentioned the copper stat before. EVs are expected to account for almost 50% of silver use in automobiles by 2040. Silver is an enormous component in these vehicles. This is not something you really hear much about. These are critical component pieces to a world in which the car, whether you believe the forecast or not, it could be wrong by 50%. It's still an enormous threat from where our market sits right now. And finally, the charging station side. Another fun fact about Cherokee, by 2030, there'll be over 20 million EV charging stations, consuming 250% more copper than in 2019. So let that sink in. So copper is going not just in EVs, we'll talk more a little later in the conversation around offshore and onshore wind turbines and how much copper is used there as well. So there is a huge demand and frankly competing demands in a world in which we're transitioning into alternative, greener sources of fuel, this will require on the underlying industrial inputs. And that's something that we need to recognize now and be prepared for that. Go forward. Specifically on copper, copper is critical in terms of any electricity related technology shift. EVs, generators, turbines, charging stations, very mentioned, pretty staggering. Copper is used to store how to conduct it. It's extremely efficient. Therefore, they're better conductor to put into a world in which electricity is transitioned through more parts of our lives and replacing other forms of power generation and power sources. So to the extent that there is a significant increase in demand, there's a really interesting fact down here on SSD Global forecast of energy transition and growth for copper outstrip non-energy transition demand through 2050. This graph on the right shows you saying of the 12% utilization this particular case of copper, what proportion of that is specifically being directed into the energy transition. Again, that's not showing you the net growth of copper. That's obviously in the midst of extremely high growth demand for copper itself, and how much that is being directed toward just the energy transition itself. So these are markets where overall copper demand is increasing, energy transition is the largest portion of that, and the numbers are pretty staggering. So interesting facts on in terms of the supply of copper, where going to come from, who has it now, who's found it, who did it, who distributed it. A couple of concerning points here. Total production is about 22 million metric tons on the production side, like Chile, about 6 million metric tons, Peru 2.5, and China is less than 2 million metric tons. But when you look at the consumption side of this, China plays an enormous role in the consumption of copper. China is the largest smelter in terms of overall metric tonnage capacity, about 10 million metric tons a year. It's the largest capacity for smelting. The three regional benchmarks of the copper market. COMEX for the North American market, we've got the majority share of physical warehouses, either demand for use consumed here. London Metals Exchange tends to be the reflective marker for European utilization. They've got networks and warehouses throughout Europe and Southern Asia. And Shanghai Futures Exchange is the third leg to that. Now that's a very popular ARB strategy for many trading firms. There's about 95% correlation between those three markets. COMEX, which is the three-leader metal market, LME and Shanghai Futures Exchange. So a number of financial purposes that pay that ARB back and forth. When you look at where that product is sourced from, it's in our market, the utilization of COMEX copper is really reflective of copper that's being consumed here and where people are heading. So if you look at our physical stock, our inventories of copper, we have about equal amount of copper in inventories to LME. So in terms of physical warehousing here in the US, the copper inventory that's in warehouses warranted on the COMEX is about the same as what LME has. So give you a sense for how important that is to the transition. Turning to aluminum, this is a market that we call in transition. A lot of aluminum is supported not just in the increasing body work for cars, but in places like solar cells, which are manufacturing. It's light, it's effective, it's efficient, and that will be again increasing demand for workers. Thank you. The chart on the right here shows the increased energy transition demand, and again, everything looks like a hockey stick because we're coming from relatively low levels. We're talking about replacing vehicles on the roads and generation of power globally, where this is traditionally not kind of sourcing. So when you look at that transition and the increased demand, a vast proportion of increased demand out through 2030 is coming from electric vehicles. That tiny sliver there is wind and northeast solar. So as you're looking at alternatives, again, these are inputs that build the infrastructure to support the transition. So if we're seeing that demand, we always have the equation versus supply coming from. What does that mean for pricing? What does that mean for securing stock or national security reasons? What does that mean for the efficiency of goods and services and how they're going to be transported? All questions that not just market participants have to land on, but the nations will land on, figure out what that means and the implications are. Another point of importance to note here that I did not put in the written materials is that this is a market where China plays a significant role. When you look at the who produces aluminum, China produces roughly 50 to 60% of aluminum. Behind China is Russia and India. So those are the top three producers of aluminum. So draw your conclusions about what that means and what you think the implications of that are. But this is, again, being an input into much of the global transition right now being produced in those three countries. China produces roughly 50% of aluminum for bauxite, followed by Australia and Brazil. And then thirdly, bauxite itself, China is actually the second largest producer, about 25% of the market is produced, bauxite produced by China. Australia is leader in about 35%. So again, there's facts on the slide here that we're consider this referential material. So we move with that, but we kind of draw a conclusion here in terms of increased demand for the source, the demand come from and how does that either make this transition easier, faster, slower, and more difficult? What kind of risk does this present to the nation states? You go for the steel point. Kind of jump a moment or two on steel. EVs use less steel than historical internal combustion engine cars, but it's a critical component in the infrastructure for solar and wind generation. So steel absolutely has a role to play. We've expanded our own steel suite of portfolio products, primarily because we're seeing a lot more demand for products like hot rolled coil steel, which is the graph of our moldings and uptake there. And also what we're seeing in as weird as it sounds, ferrous scrap features. In a world in which steel and aluminum are both expensive and energy intensive to produce, firms are looking for ways that they can reduce their footprint, reduce their power consumption to produce these materials that even in themselves will accelerate that growth of electronification out of the world. There's an implication here for how can we do more of what we already have. So it's actually a very, very viable global scrap market that tends to trade quite regionally. And when we think about scrap in a market like this, that's a big part of where people are sourcing the materials, since it tends not to go away, tends to be recycled and reused. There are some stats up here in terms of the this last bullet point, third piece on here, driven by population, economic growth, demand for steel is expected to rise 35% by 2050. I think that's probably a little bit of an underestimation given what we're already seeing right now, because the official stats we pulled from IEA. And again, concerning as these become major inputs into not just electric vehicles, now this is infrastructure, it's grid building. Typically copper, aluminum, and steel react very, very well to programs like here we're going to build infrastructure bill. Copper has always been driven by China's expansion. So they're building new cities, building infrastructure that was really booming the copper market. As a bipartisan bill went through here in the US, the copper conversation was booming the price of copper because any infrastructure bill comes with copper. And now electricity generation, green generation is carrying along these other metals with them as well. So again, the input pieces here we're not really talking about, but the increased demand have to question where the source of these are coming from and what that means going forward. Go forward to next slide, please. This is another interesting sobering chart here, and I'll share some sobering stats. But when you look at the battery metals market, most people think about cobalt, lithium, sure that's input. Don't know much about them, but we're going to run on batteries in the future, so I'm sure this market will develop. These are very small markets. These markets have just come up in the last 3 to 5 years. We've been waiting for much cobalt and lithium until we thought that there was an underlying physical supply at the source and a price reporting agency that had enough data behind it for it to be utilized for a product to trade on. We have this work with the CFTC, improved the CFTC, bringing data for them to show that the underlying price setting mechanism will be settled to is robust, and we just launched these products in the last couple of years because the market themselves were still evolving, and in some cases evolving in a very, very narrow band of countries. When you look at the battery metals at an early stage of development, limited sources. Difficult sources for these metals, particularly cobalt. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the source for 70% of the world's cobalt production, followed by Russia. On the lithium side, China accounts for, on the cobalt side, China accounts for 80 to 90% of cobalt refining. So it's largely in the DMC, or the DRC is largely refined in China, and yet these are critical components into battery metals that are going to be driving much of our fleet on a going forward basis. Lithium, Australia is about 50% of the production. But China is the biggest refiner and consumer of those products as well. So if you look at the component pieces, again, these are parts of the story. We're talking about the end result. We'll have more electronic across the street. We'll be retiring fossil fuels and internal combustion engines. What are the inputs and how we can get there? We have markets that are evolving and coming from places that have some baggage with them. That's kind of concern for all of us that we just wanted to raise. Not wanting to belabor too much on my wonderful slides here, just want to add a couple of points to conclusion. You can go on one more page. Battery metals, copper, aluminum, steel, all components, all increasingly important components to the world that is evolving around us. And I think our focal point has been on the end result of what that looks like without the process of the how. So we've already defined largely what the what is. The what is going to represent some kind of a future of a much higher degree of electric vehicles and regenerative power, but the how is what we're facing. And I think to the point that was made before, there's some policy decisions being made. I think one of the policies, recalls, I could be right with anyone. One of the policies made the point that policy decisions sometimes are being made by folks that are kind of cross-talking one another, where the end point of the legislation could be laudable, but the reality of how to get there raises a lot of challenges. And if we're not going into this eyes wide open and understanding that many of us are in the room here involved in risk management in some way. I have to serve the role of supplying products that help you manage your risk. Others that you originate that risk. Others that you can take that risk from those in the room and manage that as an asset from those that see it as a liability. But this is a world in which I don't think we spend much time thinking through the implications of what it means to be changing our future and what it means, what those inputs are going to require us to do and think about. So I'll probably leave it at that. Again, I really, really wanted to avoid doing a forced march through it. I don't know if you read the materials ahead of time, but there's some good stuff in here. I'll finish on the two final pages that you should eye candy charts here. Pick the forward one. This first one is the performance of the metal sector in a basket relative to ag and energy. So you just kind of see the not surprising the blue line there is the energy index really hurt going through the demand crunch in the early part of COVID, and that since come back, you saw that huge surge the other direction in metals, and as you see those kind of converge back together a little bit. Just give you a sense for these markets that are in some ways diverging and in other ways converging in really interesting and challenging ways. And the last chart here is the volatility chart. I added this. I think just on Sunday, it's important to, since we're in the risk management business, kind of look at what's actually happening and see the elevated levels of volatility. Aluminum is the white line, copper is orange, and steel is the green line there. So you see some pretty significant spikes here, and you see some pretty significant drop-offs as well. So to the extent that what you are seeing over time is significantly elevated levels of volatility, again, people are trying to assume what they know is to be the future point of supply for these markets, certainly the demand side. It's starting to flow through towards what is supply and what that mean for me. Some of these markets are not sufficiently big to have a built-up forward curve. They can call forward curves. The market's not big enough to do that. And so the market's trying to figure out how do I curve it or how do I put price inputs into my model. Again, this is a point that was made earlier. I think we're on the first conversation. Inputs have to be part of any economic model. This is your brain, whether it's a trading business that you follow, whether you have a trading business like Rob Kramer or supply business like BP, or any of the industry bodies here representing users and consumers, this has an impact on you. And so one of the best ways to recognize what's coming down the track, get in front of it, be part of an industry dialogue, understand what the risks are leading to this future, and that the realistic timeline that we can get there, that the policy leader possibly talking about one another. We're observers in this. We're partners with many of you in the room here. We're partners in industry bodies to understand what is your emerging risk and how can we help. How can we evolve these markets? How can we bring smart regulation in? How can we have capital requirements, risk management requirements that can make sure that we can be buffeted by volatility that looks like this? And I don't think anybody in this room here thinks that volatility is going to go away anytime soon. In a globalizing, while simultaneously deglobalizing world, I mean, ties to the one you made before, there's a lot of reasons to think that deglobalization and focusing on the benefits, demand and supply needs are important, but when you start to focus on its head, run that logic through, you think about markets like aluminum, cobalt, bauxite, these are markets where we're not the incumbent, where without globalization, we don't have those markets, we can't achieve our policy goals. So it presents some really interesting challenges for how we think about this path to electronification, how we think about a world beyond internal combustion and the speed with which we can get there. And we would like to think that it's fortunate we think about the critical role of natural gas, not as a transition fuel, but as a permanent part of our future. And I don't see a world in which natural gas is not anything other than a core staple of our future generation, not a transition fuel. It's a big part of the transition, but it's going to be around, and it has to be a part of that long-term future. So that's all I had from the prepared portion of this. Hopefully, the material was useful and helpful. Again, these are observations. I am thinking on behalf of the exchange and making these observations. These are things in our market. These are things we hear from our partners. Here's the research we've done about the forward demand of some of these markets and what's keeping our customers right now and what it's going to do to their business and how they're shaping their own underlying risks are changing. That's what we do. If we're not talking to our customers and regularly talking to our regulators, bring a vision of this is coming down the pipe. We need to be prepared for this. So we're not reactively responding on the heels of our feet, but on the ball for our feet, understanding the challenges we have, getting ahead of this, and trying to make sure that we're recognizing we're going to have supply challenges, and we're going to have increased demand for some of these markets that right now can't supply all the needs we're going to need, which needs some of the investments from that conversation. Think around EVs, not to mention moving off of domestic generation, energy generation, but generation off of coal, off of nuclear, off of other sources of traditional fuel. So there's a time implication here as well. So hopefully that was useful. I think there are folks in the room here that know a lot more about this than I do. I look forward to learning from you all, but hopefully this is useful, and I appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts. And I look forward to, I think, making this a part of a broader dialogue under Commissioner Mercenger's running of EEMAC and maybe it happen. So we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Darren. At this time, I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments from the associate members.
Hi, Conrad from VTOL. Could you talk a little bit about the dichotomy of your volumes between energy products and metals products? Because it looks like on the two charts here that your volumes and open interest are going up. In energy, it's the opposite. I mean, you're seeing record, I mean, they're not record low, but certainly many year low open interest and volumes. And, you know, for stability of prices, for the stability of markets in general, you know, obviously it's good to have a robust, like high open interest, lots of participants. So are you doing anything different in metals markets to encourage participation, or is it just the tail?
Yeah, so a couple of things in there. I think when you actually look at the energy, you're absolutely right. Certainly in our crude oil business, we're seeing that now. It's actually not the case in natural gas, which I don't think should surprise anybody. We're seeing, I think we're up 10% a year in that gas futures and options are about 16% in volume. If you look at the crude side, I think WTI futures are flat this year, options are up about 6%. A lot of people say, well, gosh, shouldn't that be a whole lot higher given the kind of volatility we're seeing? A couple points on that. So we are seeing, where we are seeing, I don't want to not talk about this, is open interest drop off. We saw WTI open interest drop about 23%. We saw Brent open interest on ICE drop, I think about the same 23, 24%. What's interesting is, and I don't know if you've looked at this, but we're seeing that drop off in futures almost entirely offset by an increase in options open interest. And in markets like this, these are brutal markets. That volatility is largely reflective of and if you look at how difficult that is, you and Rob would know better than I about how difficult that is to hedge flat price and work like that. We're seeing much larger proportion of our customers move options. So we saw 23% downdraft in open interest WTI futures. think our WTI options are up about 6 or 7%. Volume was staying flat, I think, in WTI futures and up in options. So when you look at the aggregate portfolio that customers are using, we're seeing much higher proportion of options. So that actually exchange-wide is most dramatic in energy and metals. Actually, I realize that is most dramatic in equities. You see the kind of volatility we're seeing in equity. Our equity future business, our equity option open interest is up about 50%. Our equity futures open interest is about down 2%. So I think what we're seeing is a combination of a few different things. There's an energy policy concern here in terms of, hey, it might some demand for WTI to be lower over time. Working on that, but I don't think that anybody thinks that the WTI and Brent are going away in 3 to 5 years. We are seeing a rotation of products being used to manage that, much higher proportion of options rather than futures. And of the makeup of that OI drop-off, it was largely drop-offs in financial players. And this goes all the way back to a point that actually Tyson and Bob were talking about. Margins in WTI futures have been pre-Ukraine war went from 6% of notional crude trading 65 to 13% of notional crude trading 130. We're back down to that 8% of notional crude trading 85 to 90 WTS specifically. So elevated levels of capital required, absolutely appropriate. In this big world, we need to make sure that our buffers are appropriate to manage any kind of price dislocation. But just as Rob mentioned before, we did see an increased pop-up of FTMs on top of exchange minimum, so just deleverage that much more. A long way of saying that the biggest pullback in participation in open interest and volume was buy-side financial players, which is not surprising. Financial players are the most sensitive to deleveraging. So increased cost of trading, they shifted over to trading more metals, they're trading more equities right now. So we consider this a cyclical shift, not a structural shift. In terms of anything we're doing different, no, other than continuing to explore the merits and the benefits of trading options in a really challenging by heavy environment like this. And just so I don't overrepresent what the metals group says, metals actually down in aggregate is actually down this year, that kind of level. That's largely on the precious metal side, which is about 70% of our business, but base metal business is doing very well. Not surprising business that we're talking about here. Again, same impact there. Largely, it's the buy side of some banks, pullback trading commercials, and users are largely maintaining about year-on-year people. So those are things we worry about. Are you losing your commercial end users for using financial credit? Are you losing retail? And are you losing your farmers and competitors out there? So it makes sense to us that we're continuing to make sure that we're putting the best product out there and get the best margin off this. We did increase and change the kind of collateral we're accepting now, so allowing customers to use. We enabled gold warrants as collateral about 3.5 years ago. That's been a record use of over $4 billion of margin, which frees up on balance sheet margin for banks. We just started accepting this. We approved about a month ago a certain set of ETF, and customers can put that forward, and that's for trading any online product they want. So trying to understand the challenges of a rates rising environment makes cash less easily accessible. So making sure we're working with our customers to leverage the assets they have to leverage what they can. Really long answer to a simple question, but hopefully it's not a simple question. Great. Okay. Happy to go deep over a drink after this if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you. John Melby with The Expansive. Derek, appreciate the presentation and especially look towards the energy transition, the battery markets, the lithium, coal, palladium we talked about. Stated that they're relatively small at this stage, but expected to explode. Curious how much that is traded on exchange versus bilateral. Do you have a sense for that? And then to the assumption that a lot of that is still bilateral, wonder if it's a function of the scale of the market where it currently is. You mentioned a little bit about the market infrastructure, what's around price reporting, things like that. Also, I was wondering if the number of counterparties, types of counterparties, really the thought process of where that is in that evolution.
Yeah, great question. To be honest, we have both a cobalt and a lithium futures contract. Cobalt does trade as the chart that we have, which is not right now, but if you've got the materials, the chart we put up there is the volume and open interest. By CME standards, we trade 20 million contracts a day. Putting a chart up that says we're trading 5,000 contracts a day doesn't look very impressive. Understand these markets are tiny, and that's the frustrating part of this. Oh, it's one that says CME Group runs the biggest metals. It's about 2 back from this one. Go backwards. Before that one. So that chart in and of itself is not impressive, but relative to the size of the market, John, it's still a small market, largely coming from single scary countries. We didn't even get to a point where we could go to the CFTC to put forward a contract spec until we had at least 2 to 3 years of data from a price reporting agency. In this case, it's Fast Markets that we're using. Platts is trying to get there, Argus is trying to get there. And there have been, LME has actually had a contract since 2015 that's never traded a contract. They've got the wrong price assessment agency there, way before that market was ready. We are a derivatives market, we're not a physical market. So if we're going to introduce a futures contract, it's going to be the central case, it's going to be the CCP mechanism. Because to be in the CCP mechanism, it's got to be unwound. Positions have to be rolled back in the case of stress. CFTC knows that better than anybody. And so for us to be able to make that case that we can do that, we need a market that's sufficiently deep and liquid in the physical market with enough participants, broad enough participation. And right now, both cobalt and lithium are there, but lithium we launched 2 years ago and it still has yet to trade. Doesn't necessarily surprise because a lot of that is a small number of bilateral physical participants that are not putting in business on exchange. We think over time that will grow over time. We needed to make sure that we were out there with the one product that the market does have, and there is some bilateral CCP and liquid trading happening. That is cobalt. As I said, LME listed this a number of years ago and still has yet to trade a contract. So they're small, they're narrow, and to be very frank, our risk management around this is sufficiently high. These are not highly levered products. Like Bitcoin is like a 40%, initial margin contract for us. Cobalt and lithium are high initial margin contracts for us as well. So it's not a market that's prime time ready for prop traders and BlackRock to come in and start swinging around and it's going to get there over time. So the charts are going, it's going to get there. What we bring is 170 years of market knowledge, how to run CCP markets, how to bring and build ecosystems, how to globalize markets, bring makers and takers together, how to do that electronically to connect the markets globally. So we're as tiny as these are. I never show somebody graphs and we're doing 3,000 a day. That's something to crow about. But this represents not an insignificant portion of this market. So again, a lot of answers to this single question there, but it's a combination of us also coming to a market like in Bitcoin. We brought a product to market that was going to appeal to folks that want to be in a credit-enabled market, and it's not going to appeal to a lot of folks that don't want anything to do with a regulated market. We want to bring transparency, we want to bring that CCP mechanism, bring stability, bring counterparty risk mitigation to markets like this, because this is where the market's going to go. And this is not just us trying to be smarter than the market. This is us working with our customers, many in the room, to say, what's your emerging risk, and how can we help manage that market risk? So small market that's en route to something bigger, I think is going to be so.
Jeff?
Yes, Jeff Hume, Continental Resources. You mentioned these markets, commodities are very isolated. And is there a concern of having enough liquidity in these markets as we grow forward? Is there policy that you see that needs to be made to open that up? Because I just read an article about, I believe it's Honda, one of the Japanese car companies just made a direct contract with business in another foreign country for their supply, and they're going around the market, if you will. They're not out on the market. So is there a concern for that? Because that can create a black swan event we're not seeing today that had occurred, because it's just you don't have a liquidity, you don't have a vision for what's out there, and when does the mind run out, and all of a sudden we've made as a country a huge bet on something that fails us, and that's the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a risk. We don't need another 2008 that was largely bilateral transactions that were unknown to the broader ecosystem that presented a much larger proportion of risk, and frankly, anybody in the system did. I was in banking as a trader for 16 years of my career in Europe, trading FX options, trading products, and there was that world doesn't exist anymore. That put as much bilateral as you can, make your bid-ask spread, largely that principle-based model has shifted in light of, I think, all the right legislation that came out of 2008. Pendulum maybe swung a little too far. But I think in our estimation, markets grow and mobilize when you create transparency, when they're well regulated, when you ensure customer protections, where you have mechanisms in your market that disallow the kinds of the market imposed you've seen in the past, whether it's things like velocity logic or price parity or position limits or our requirements to ensure that we allow only maximum position limit by certain purposes in equilibrium. All of those things are part and parcel of running markets well, even in the face of the economic stress we've seen in these last 8 months. I think there is a risk where you see too much regulation or capital constraints go so far that you put people out of the market and go to either the least regulated environment, which is the worst outcome for everybody, or where you leave liquidity out of your core benchmark markets and you force people to sidelines. Those are both terrible outcomes. So we try to always focus on the we as an exchange, we serve vertically traded exchange, clearinghouse, and exchanges with 2 functions: one, price discovery, and number 2, risk management. And we never sacrifice. We would never go to the points of lowering the margin collateral risk management requirements for the sake of, well, I need to make this market bigger. We would never risk that of the two. The higher priority is quality risk management, because that's if that breaks down. And frankly, you saw that in a certain market earlier this year in Europe, and that's been damaging that market, and frankly, associated markets as well. So there is that concern. Our goal is take the proven track record that we built in markets that are emerging and growing. Make sure that people understand the greater benefit of being in a regulated environment with customer protections, with market protections, with market and systemic mechanisms to avoid kind of runs on prices, yet but also effectively price discovery. So there are folks that will try to strike off the bilateral transactions. That is becoming harder. Capital rules have become harder. Capital rules have also made on exchange trading harder as well. Good intentions that sometimes go a little too far. To answer your question, Jeff, I'm not missing anything.
Bob?
So, thank you, Paul, for some great charts.
Before Paul arrived,
I live on charts. I'm going to do something. These charts, and this is the question for Paul, so sort of something to think about, especially for regulators, is if I go back to the good old days, there was a time when I was a chief risk officer, and there were charts like that, and it was going to happen when we were going to, the goal was to build vaporization plants in the U.S. because LNG was going to come to the U.S. big time. There was a technology change that occurred. Thank goodness we didn't do that. Technology fracking appeared, and all of a sudden now LNG is going the other way. We would have been positioned in a horrible spot. I would encourage something called scenario planning. It's a big part of risk management when you're not talking about a really liquid market in a short term. When we're looking at these things, forecasts, those charts are one scenario. Paul listed in one of his bullets a bunch of factors that like political shifts, technology changes. There's a number of things that could happen. It would be really interesting if you look further at this role of metals to look at scenarios rather than just the forecast that people want to show. If the hockey stick may actually be flat, it may be delayed many years. How would that affect these new markets, for example, if it doesn't show up, or if there are new ones that are of interest? And as hard as that sounds, it can be really informational going through that exercise of scenario planning where you just think about, well, what are the things that might happen? Sometimes it changes your focus for risk management from doing one thing to, well, maybe I can focus on the underlying threats to that and make sure those things don't happen. So that would be a really interesting perspective on the same topic Paul showed is what are the scenarios possibly play out in the next 10 years.
That's great. And speaking as Derek, who I am, I'm not the fourth Paul. Welcome, Derek. I came in this podcast now. And if you, there's actually interesting, you made that point. You flip back to the chart that says copper is key material. We tried to do that. We actually took that, if the Paris Accord was implemented versus versus where we are right now. That's not the only place we did do it, and I have no vested interest in making these charts through. But we're like you, we're planning for a world where we get a vastly different set of numbers. We go back and forth and lead copper. Backward again. Yeah, there we go. So the chart on the right there kind of does it's one particular product. That's the one that was the cleanest. Well, if all of the Paris Accord agreements were implemented, it would be almost 43-44%. The step says if current policies has already been approved versus where we are today versus our 10 years. And so you can see even from over the last 10 years, not a big change. You start to see that lift up, even if you just say nothing more than what's already been approved today happens. And then there's the Paris Accord stuff. And this is not in business. Nobody knows what the future is going to be. So anybody knew it would be, I wouldn't have a job, neither would you, you know this in the world. So we're in the business of working in uncertain landscapes and uncertainty, and there's so much in stuff. I hate hockey stick charts. We joke about that before, but some of these things, if the world is going where current policy is pointing, we can't be behind the curve on this stuff. We have to recognize what's going to drive this. And it's like, okay, I'll come back to the what. Everybody seems to be aligned that there's going to be on the what of the future is going to look like. I'm always talking about how we're going to get there. And I think, to your point, that's where the risk is. I think there's a risk in how far is it going to go? Does it get the Paris Accord? Does it exceed the Paris Accord? How long is it going to take? How violent is it going to be? And what kind of national challenges do we face if we start to fight other countries for effectively limited resources? And could this be an own goal if we're not careful? So if we start to put ourselves in a locked-in future without a clear path and certain path for the underlying necessary inputs, but talk about risk, chili crickets, that's a world in which hopefully you're not retired by it. Who knows? You're a young man, maybe you'll still be doing this. So thank you. Yeah, no, it's a great point though. I'm sure everyone else in the room are trying to do exactly that. How you handicap this is that it's just a 10% probability, it's 50% probability. And there's just that the unknowns are becoming more clear every day, which makes it fun.
Frank?
I want to start by just saying thank you, Commissioner Messinger, for pulling this together and sponsoring this sort of discussion. Discussion earlier today on physical infrastructure was absolutely riveting, if you will, and as a discussion on the metals and transition. So thinking back, price formation and integrity in that price formation is one of the key cornerstones to the markets. I mean, we just lived through a situation with LIBOR where everyone started transitioning to SOFR. I mean, having confidence in the formation of prices. So one question I have for you really deals around with price formation. How when you put these metals on market, how what sort of criteria you go through. And then the thing that kind of came to mind as you were talking is, a lot of these rare earths and metals are located in parts of the world that are not necessarily a whole flags list of people who want to do business with, right? So with that being said, it'd be kind of good to understand how you kind of address that. And particularly, we did mention the need to kind of prevent the off exchange by allowing, we want people to be centrally favored, right? That's the easiest way to kind of manage any sort of spend versus the other one. So if you could just touch on those couple points, I would share that.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning the SOFR migration as well. That's something that I don't think people understand, that the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that are historically been tied to LIBOR, that in the span of effectively 10 months, we migrated 100% of that business, both for futures and options on our market. Now you've got, I think, over 1,000 folks that are like the term SOFR rate, with everyone's reference to SOFR after effectively April 1st. I like to think that we did that so well that we are not talking about it because it was just super good to do well. But that's a magnitude of risk that I think is equivalent to what we're talking about here. So it's a great point. Now I think that was a little bit different in that there was a set date. Everybody said we knew with certainty by this date on where it ceased to exist. And it is the result of the blowing up of the problems from a number of years ago. So it took the market 10 years to get to this point. But that's a great example of seeing what's changing, adapting to it, having a fixed endpoints, and everybody aligning on let's do this in a way that is riskless as possible, and come together as an industry. I think the problem with everything we're talking about here is the timelines are uncertain. Frankly, the agendas of folks are uncertain as well. There are different people that have different goals for, do they want to see these markets on exchange or not? A bunch of folks are making a ton of money in the physical market, in these scary places. That's like I said earlier, that went on a piece of paper, China, Russia, Democratic Republic of Congo, these are places that, aren't really number one for saying, yeah, I love to put my stuff into a highly regulated exchange under the CFTC in the US. So what we do have is, you've got this, it's not an economy, but you've got physical sources of raw materials instead of places that are kind of used by global participants, much larger. The demand side for that product is massively larger than the supply side of that product. And so the demand side of that fit in regulated markets, fit in first world countries, and they know that they need those customers protected. They know they need those price setting mechanisms that have proven resiliency in every kind of environment for the last 170 years. And so there's nothing we can do on the policy side to force bilateral physical market to shut down. We are a derivative market, so we go to the CFTC and ask for approval to run a product. It is an incredibly detailed analysis that we have to run. We could be convinced ourselves, convince the CFTC to get us approval of this product, which is actually where our cobalt and lithium contracts are financially settled, not physically settled. Because we don't have warehouses in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Russia and onshore in China. So these are markets where there is legitimate price risk right now. And so we can only get there by, because we're not going to put a warehouse onshore in this country to have physically delivered lithium and cobalt in countries that we can't really operate in. So, we have to work with our customers and say, well, the next best thing is the financial solution, got a financial settled alternative to meet the whole economic. It doesn't be material, but it insulates you or helps insulate you from price. So I feel like I forgot your question. And so when we go to the CFTC, we have to show that there are sufficient number of takers, sufficient number of takers, that they're off that list where takers can bring off that list. That the first and foremost, the underlying physical market that it's predicated on is in and of itself sufficient with and broad, and that's why we did this lithium contract launch in March of 2020. Because the price reporting agencies that work there, we think we're doing a broad enough job and we're showing prices from a broad enough number of prices. Some of these guys are saying, well, there's a trade a month and that becomes the market. So some of the physical markets, we are derivative, we had to evolve, only the speed of the physical market can evolve. I would say one place that is a little bit different than that, there's actually a long futures market alongside a spot or a cash market. It's actually with the voluntary carbon market that John Melly runs, we provide the futures product on the back of that for our global emissions offset contract. And that's a market that, we're going to see annual futures and carbon offsets in the voluntary global market. People have to partner with the spot market and kind of build the futures market in real time, the cash market. And the benefit was immediate. Literally, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost within a week of announcing the futures contract on the back of connected using expansive markets for the underlying market of our futures, volume significantly increased in the spot value because people knew that there was a viable cash to futures basis. And so that means you're automatically expanding significantly the participants. So it's a long-winded answer to the critical question, the parts of it, but we have to show the depth of participation. We need to show that the prices that our markets settle to is robust with enough participants that represents the real underlying physical markets, customers can trust it and people trust it. A market that we can risk manage, either because it has a tight enough basis correlation to other products in our portfolio, or because the risk management around that product itself, whether it's additional margins or the price standing or the position notice that our products managing on market are reflective of the risk index. So it's all of those things together. And you're absolutely right about the price setting piece. As I mentioned before, there are two main components. There's price discovery and risk management, I would always give risk management as a higher priority. If you don't have risk management, there's no consequence in right discovery, but you can have right discovery in the form of more robust risk management.
Thank you to the EMAC associate members. I don't see any other questions from the associate members. I think we will move to the EMAC members and open the floor to questions and comments from EMAC members on Derek's presentation. Tyson?
Thank you. First, again, Derek, awesome presentation, heavy reliance on data. I think we all appreciate that. So I've got first a comment and then a question about sort of the aftershocks of the London Metals Exchange nickel fiasco that I'm eager to.
Your words, not mine.
Yes, so I think what you've accurately described here is that this transition, which isn't on the horizon, we're right in the thick of it, is resulting in new sources of needed production that have commodity source risks. And as has been explained, some of these commodities are being sourced from not so nice places. But this isn't a new phenomenon. I mean, U.S. energy policy was literally defined from the 1970s on until the fracking revolution of 2008 by significant commodity source risks from not only countries that weren't nice places, but that were actively hostile to our national security interests. And we weathered that storm. But I do agree that too few advocates dismissed the realities of the challenges of this commodity source risk. I would say, however, that we are seeing a fairly significant transition here from, because with renewables anyway, you've got commodity price and source risk in the construction, but not on the operation, right? Because the fuel input is not subject to that risk because it's renewable. Whereas we are still actively seeing, as we just have been discussing today, active commodity price risk on the fossil fuel side. And so clearly there are challenges that your presentation and your data have outlined. And I participated in a roundtable that was organized by the New York Times this summer that included a lot of industry stakeholders on energy issues and also political folks like the French ambassador to the US and the Ukraine ambassador to the US. And among the participants was the CEO of AES Corporation, or utility operator, but also owner of fossil fuel and renewable generation. And he made a really important comment. He said, prior to the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, our supply chain mantra was the number one variable was least cost. Yeah. He's like, we have completely changed that. We are now looking at stability of getting access. And I think, and I assume we've got a lot of very savvy market participants here that are dealing with supply chain challenges. But I assume that this has been the wake up call. And that, I mean, we see it in, we recently heard from a major operator of oil storage terminals, who talked about they, before the pandemic, had completed construction of steel intensive infrastructure. And this person was saying, if we tried to do that today with the supply chain challenges, it would have been far more expensive. Now that's different. That's sort of COVID related supply chain. And this is talking about commodity source risks. But when I looked into this, and I was going off of some comments that Tesla had made a couple of years ago, where they said we wanted to line up lithium supplies from Cuba, which is not nearly as big a producer as some others, but it still is in the top 10 lithium producers in the world. Little Cuba. And Tesla's like, we can't get access to it because of US sanctions. Does that make sense? In the world of 2022, with what's going on with Russia, which is a huge supply of critical materials for a whole bunch of things, I think we need to probably reevaluate this list of who is sanctioned and who isn't. Is Cuba really a threat to national security? Is there an opportunity there to negotiate, to get access to needed materials for this energy transition. Same with Canada and Australia. A lot of companies are swooping in. These countries have massive stockpiles. A lot of this, and it doesn't seem like there is a urgency to efforts to negotiate access to some of these. And you know, with Australia, there's lots of competing factors for their market destinations. And so that's all I wanted to say on that. That, you know, the transition features some bumps. This is not unprecedented. We've dealt with this for a very long time in the energy industry, and I think we just need to reassess some relationships and opportunities to access some of these. And also, the industry is just constantly, you know, producing ingenuity to deal with some of these factors. But the question I have, and thank you for tolerating my very long comment. I follow closely, in my words, the chaos of the collapse of nickel trading on the London Metals Exchange, where basically there was one large Chinese-based producer who tried to orchestrate a big short, but that went wrong, and because of the size of this position, the London Metals Exchange essentially had to cancel tons of orders, and it was. So what's going to be aftershock of that? Are we seeing? And I don't fully understand, you know, who is on the London Metals Exchange for nickel versus who's on CME. But can you just talk about sort of what have been some of the ramifications of that, and whether or not there is more interest from folks to go to the apparently better regulated CFTC jurisdictional venues that I would imagine would not tolerate what sort of went on in London. So yeah,
I'll dig into the question you didn't ask early on, but I'll respond to my own comment. On the supply chain thing, there's actually a great article in the Wall Street Journal sometime in the last few days on exactly this point. Everybody's rethinking what their supply chain, what's the prime, what's the is it just in time to propose the crop, or is it resiliency? And everyone said, well, resiliency is way down here, because we assume in the world of zero interest rates, everything is free to get wherever we want. No just in time thing, and resiliency and robustness is both secondary. And so that's been completely flipped around. So it's a fabulous article. It came out just in the last couple of days, and it's worth reading. It's exactly that point. That was a great point. I think it also challenges some that want to deglobalize until you recognize that we can't put the walls up too high, because you can in gas and oil, but we can't in a future world. I personally don't think gas is going away ever, and I don't think oil is going away for a long time to come. It'll be a long transition. But in a world in which these are resource constrained and the supply doesn't sit inside of our castle walls, that makes us rethink, is globalization a good thing or a bad thing? It was argued earlier today that can really hurt us, but then if you take that to a logical extreme, you're pricing yourself out of markets, and we won't get to participate in the future that everybody has kind of already agreed with is going to be part of our future. I think there's dialogue that needs to happen there. But there's a great piece that we haven't read on the supply chain resiliency behind now, the primary reason behind people rethinking how they get the product and source product. On the LME stuff, I think that the broad contours of the event is correct. I think there was one large Chinese producer, and he actually owned a different grade of nickel, big nickel, I think it's called, which is not deliverable. And so he was an enormous short, not to squeeze it down, but because his idea was he would be able to deliver his, at least on with an appropriate basis price differential that would work for him. And so it did. And then so that was one thing. Now there's a whole bunch of questions. Forget coding market and canceling transactions. How that was allowed to happen is the first question I was asking. How did one player get to amass an outsized position of a short in a single market, even if it was using different counterparties? How did nobody know that? What mechanisms were in place around the risk management for position limits, or accountability levels, or being able to see the offsetting position, all those things that frankly are a part and parcel of our everyday money markets. I think the people that were trading nickel on the LME assumed for those that trade copper, gold, and silver, and treasury bonds and WTI and CME, that all risk management is the same. The lesson learned is not all risk management. FCA has some planning to do. We're going to have to work through that. There are two investigations being done right now, one by the Bank of England, one by the FCA, to look at the decisions that were taken and how those markets were run. The short answer is, the shorter answer is, they lack positionless, they lack the regulatory authority to oversight them and hold them accountable, asking, why are you holding this outside position? They didn't have mechanisms in place to slow or stop their price movements. They didn't have any of the accountability that we have in our markets. So the outcome, number one, is people coming to us and saying, the first question is, could this happen at CME? And it's absolutely not. We're walking through all the things and how our markets work and how the protections work. And the next question is, when are you going to open a nickel market? It's no time soon. Nickel is another one of those kind of scary and narrow markets. So when we do have this robust copper market, an aluminum market that's now tripled in volume, not surprisingly, over the last couple of months, as a result of people saying, I can't trust that. And back in the point before, two functions, price discovery and risk management. When risk management blows up, the price discovery is gone. You are no longer market disruptive. So we're seeing a lot of inquiry about whether and how to set this in the business industry. That they're treating outstanding investigations. Did I get rid to each of the people? Absolutely. Okay, cool.
Bill?
Thank you. Bill McCoy of Morgan Stanley. And thanks. It's been a really, as was this morning, it's a very thought-provoking discussion and a very good presentation, Derek. I wanted to follow up, and maybe this is part of, as Bob was talking earlier, about scenario analysis issues. And I was thinking, I understand that the U.S. includes aluminum and zinc, and it's critical minerals list. And copper, I don't think is part of it at this point. And given all the vulnerabilities of the supply chain we've been discussing, and the metals area potential because of the demand outstripping supply, and then of course just the global dependencies. And Tyson mentioned, I think you mentioned it was Australia and Canada with respect to stockpiling. Well, do you foresee issues arising with not just the U.S. but other governments, friendly governments, and others running challenges? Basically revisiting their critical mineral strategies and building up stockpiles, and what impact that will have with respect to a number of both the physical and the derivative markets.
It's a great question. I think when you look at these charts, can you actually go back a couple? That there's an early chart that I think speaks to this. It's the second page. So here effectively going for a hockey stick. This isn't forecast. This is actual just historical over the last 10 years. It doesn't take much to figure out this isn't flattening anytime soon. No matter how high or how steeply sloped anyone thinks this is going to be, there's no put machine that can flop. And when you look at, and this is just the finished product, so this represents all the component inputs that are required. At some point in time, I would think that the same way we've had a strategic petroleum reserve, there should be a strategic copper reserve, a strategic cobalt reserve, and other ways in which we want to make sure that we've got the necessary inputs that are not native to the U.S., where we are a net importer. And it's, for as bad as it is for the U.S., it's way worse for places like, Japan and, other island nations where they don't have any raw material, they import everything, including all their electricity and gas power through natural gas. So I would think, and I'm not a policy person, and I don't speak policy very often, but I don't know how you look at a world in which the key inputs into and the key source of price volatility for where the future is going, or that when they're not native to you physically, you're in a tough spot. You're a price taker all the time. What the price takers want to do, they want to warehouse to make sure you can manage that risk, to keep that material. So I would think that as we historically thought about oil as a thing that we want to have enough of, so it's a buffet, I think it's a shock absorber analogy, Commissioner Mercer, you mentioned before, to be able to accommodate for any shocks in supply. The demand side is there clearly, but any supply shocks on anything, particularly this is why I mentioned verbally, not on paper, some of those actors out there that are large smelters, large provider, consumers of stuff that we think we're the. So I think you're right. From policy people listening to this, I think Bill makes a great point. And I think that I would think that naturally the conversation would come back on what's international security, right? I mean, right now the reality is with the natural gas production that we have, Henry Hub is the basis price for LNG, which is going out to Europe and Asia. So de facto, the US physical and the market same price for natural gas right now. It's being buffeted by demand that Europe right now. Because Europe shut off Nord Stream 2, now Nord Stream 1. That's just a straight up lack of supply issue. Right now, the world is coming back to pricing every Mach Henry up because the global market is now pricing LNG off and it has for years. And now liquefaction is running flat out. We've got three more plants, 4 more plants coming online in the next 5 years. So that can become a big portion of the world's pricing to be able to be right. Not the case in the markets where we don't have the natural supply. So I would think, though, that a lot of people think, hey, I know our government has talked about the heating process for this as well. Any circle that we can run in and we advocate for that, I think would be ourselves in favor for sure. It's a really good point.
Not seeing any other questions or comments from EEMAC members. Do we have any comments or questions from our commissioners? Based on the panel discussion on the metals market's role in transitional energy, is there a motion from an EEMAC member that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to metals market's role in transitional energy?
I motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
It has been moved and properly seconded that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to the physical energy infrastructure of, related to the metal market's role in transitional energy. So at this time, I'm sorry. Myself here. Are there any questions or comments related to that proposal from any of the associate members? I will now open the floor to questions and comments from the EEMAC members. Are there any questions or any comments from the EEMAC members? Not seeing any additional questions or comments, we'll now take a vote on the motion that the EEMAC recommend to the commission that it consider establishing a subcommittee to provide a report to the EEMAC related to the metals market's role in transitional energy. As a point of order, a simple majority of the 9 present EEMAC members necessary.
Call the roll. Thank you, Dina. EEMAC members, when I call your name, please indicate your agreement with I, disagreement with nay, or indicate your abstention from the vote. Please remember to unmute your audio and then mute your audio. Here's Leanne, I speak to US. You can indicate your vote in the chat if you need to. I'll come back to you. Ron Kramer, FAA-PCG.
Aye.
Our finger votes aye. Dimitri Caruso's no change LLC.
Aye.
Dimitri Caruso's votes aye. William McCoy, Morgan Stanley.
Aye.
William McCoy votes aye. Local Creek Edison Electric Institute.
Abstain.
Local Creek abstains. Jackie Roberts, Public Service Commission, West Virginia.
Aye.
Jackie Roberts votes aye. Derek Seaman, CME Group.
Aye.
Derek Seaman votes aye. Tyson Slocum, Public Citizen.
Aye.
Tyson Slocum votes aye. Dina Wiggins, National Gas Supply Association. Aye. Dina Wiggins votes aye. Drew Bland. Okay. With 8, we still have a quorum, so we can vote. Madam Chair, you have 7 yes votes, 0 no votes, and 1 abstention.
ayes have it, and the motion carries. The recommendation to form an EMAC committee to provide a report to the EMAC on the role of metals and transitional energy market design has been adopted and will be submitted to the commission for its consideration. I think that concludes our work for today. So thanks to everyone who was here. Thanks to our presenters and members of EMAC and the associate members. We appreciate all the conversation and input. Thank you to the commissioner for sponsoring us again. Thank you to Lauren for all of her work of making sure that the trains are running on time and that we all get this done. None of us could make this happen without Lauren's assistance. And we look forward to participating in the next meeting and look forward to hearing where we will be meeting the next time. We're going to continue on this lovely trend of being outside of Washington. So over to you.
Well, I'll keep my closing remarks very short. First, this has been an educational experience for me. I didn't hear a lot of questions from me, but that's mostly because I am in the kind of, absorbing mode here. There's so much information and so much to process, but that's exactly what I was hoping for. And I think we definitely, accomplished that. I really wanted the discussions before EMAC to be beyond kind of surface level discussions, and I wanted something where we would dig a little bit deeper and discuss things a little bit further beyond just scratching the surface. And I think we've done that here today, and I think we'll continue to do that. And these issues are too important to not dig a little bit deeper. So I'm looking forward to future meetings, subcommittees, and I just think we can do a lot of really interesting work through this advisory committee and certainly provide the commission with a lot of value from the expertise in the room and virtually and through these discussions. So I definitely look forward to, where we go next, what we discuss next, and just continuing to learn from all of you. So again, thank you to OSU for hosting us. Thank you, Dina and Lauren, for making sure this all went off without a hitch. And with that, I'll check to see if the chairman or any of the other commissioners have closing remarks.
Thanks, Commissioner Mercier. I'll be quick as well. Really great conversation. And I think highlighting the reason why this is such an important topic. And as the commissioner said, going to be extremely valuable to us as an agency as we think about how our markets intersect with these really, really tough issues. As the energy transition continues, what can we do at the agency to facilitate product development, product innovation, to make sure markets are transparent and fair and orderly? Because there's going to be a lot of downstream and upstream issues with sourcing and production and getting these products into the hands ultimately of manufacturers and then of course consumers at a cost-effective rate that's going to support the economy, going to support labor, and continued growth for our country in the future. So I love having these discussions because as much as they are a part of our markets, and the commissioner noted this is real economy stuff. It affects people at home. And I think that's what I love about our markets and the CFTC the most. And when we can talk about these at times heady issues, but very practical issues also, I think it gives us all a sense of energy, no pun intended, and just sort of ambition that we need to do our job really well. We need to care about what we do. We need to think hard about what we do. And then ultimately we need to engage with you. And that's why we're here. That's why advisory committees are so valuable to the agency and the US government generally. And thank all of you for your service, your time, your commitment, and ultimately your expertise. So thanks to the committee, thanks to OSU, go Cowboys. Thanks to Lauren and Dina, of course, a longtime EMAC member, but I know there's many longtime EMAC members, and we appreciate your service and commitment to the CFTC. So thanks again to Commissioner Mercier.
Thank you, Chairman Benham, and thank you, Dina. I could not do it without you and your facilitation. So, Dina, that is definitely underrated.
And thank you, Commissioner Mercinger. I truly am fortunate to have this opportunity to serve as the Secretary of the EMAC, and I'm really looking forward to all the good work that comes out of this committee. Thank you to all the EMAC members and associate members for your participation in today's meeting. Please keep an eye out for future communications on the formation of the EMAC subcommittees and for plans for the next meeting. Very exciting. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.